paragraph 8.
Yes, yes, and I'm still not up on why one would go into sort of ideas about deism and theism and contrast them in this
Yes.
particular circumstance.
Yes. Let me drop paragraph 8 in there again, just so we remember where we were, and then we can move on to paragraph 9. But yes, the deism theism contrast, or theism deism, I guess was the order. We did theism first, didn't we?
And
Yeah.
the demon came up and crept and whispered into your ear, what's it going to be like if you spend the rest of eternity on paragraph 8, going over it again and again?
Well, we moved quickly. We got through paragraph 7 and 8 last time, so I don't think we'll be spending eternity here. This was my prediction. It's taken us a while to get there, but my prediction was that the chapters after chapter 4 will go a little faster than chapter 4, because
Oh,
he.
oddly enough, I might just mention this bit about Laplace's demon
Yeah, please.
and the possibilities of eternal return. I haven't read it, but it seems Schopenhauer discussed Laplace's demon in that 1838 paper he won the little award for, although he still remained an unknown.
Let's take a look here. Laplace's demon.
Well, they come down to this idea that the cosmos was just a big machine, little
Yes.
atoms bouncing off each other for the rest of eternity.
Yes.
And of course, if you think about it, the implication is there that, well, we would repeat something like us, or even perfect duplicates would appear again and again throughout time.
Yeah, you can see the effect on Nietzsche there, can't you, with the eternal return? Uh,
Well, I think personally, I don't think he cared about himself being a free being, but the idea that the cosmos was, he was participating in a cosmos, which was in an eternal trap, depressed him horribly,
yes.
or made him feel ecstatic, whichever way you want to go.
Yeah.
Uh, well, the story is he came up with the thought when he was looking at that rock in the lake, thinking, I'll be back at this moment for the rest of eternity. It'll return.
There are times we feel that way when we're hiking in the wilderness and we get somewhere that evokes that pensive mood. I remember feeling that way on a ridge on Mount Baker. We'd gotten off to a late start, my dad and my brother and I. We were still young, and Dad wasn't entirely organized in his hikes, and so we didn't get there in time. And by the time we got up there, it was 2 hours past lunch, and it's going to take a while to get down. And we were getting a little nervous, but we sat and ate lunch, and as we were sitting there, what started out as a sunny day turned into a partly cloudy day, and then gradually we could see all the clouds moving towards us. We're sitting on the ridge looking downhill. There's glacier to the right and there's a glacier to the left, and downhill is the long way back towards the lowlands that we drove up from and then hiked up from. And these clouds are moving in like a Steven Spielberg movie effect. I mean, not high speed, but as we're eating lunch, you look up 5 minutes later and it's, well, there's a lot more clouds. They're a lot closer. It created this feeling of timelessness, and that feeling that it reminded me of any other time as a kid. I'd sat and watched the clouds moving in the sky, but now I felt like I was in them. And that Laplace sensation you're describing with the stone, that's pretty much how I felt there. It's like, this is an eternal moment. I could be here forever.
Okay, you've moved from the mystical to perhaps slightly transcendental.
Yes. Well, for us, nature was, our church, if you will, from the way, given the way we were raised. Um,
A type of piety.
a type of piety, yes. Yes. So I'm going to jump kind of um, abruptly towards a topic that we were talking about last week that Donna brought up. And that has to do with Ecclesiastes, which which we discussed. And I talked with my wife afterwards, and she clued me in. It had been a while since I'd looked at Ecclesiastes. That Ecclesiastes is not in the Apocrypha; it's in the main Bible. It's Ecclesiasticus that's in the Apocrypha. And so I'm putting the links here to correct the error that I made last week. My bad. Um, so Ecclesiasticus might be Apocrypha, but Ecclesiastes is has always been canon. And Ecclesiasticus, I think, is what it's accepted as part of the canon by Catholics and by Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox Christians, but it's left out of the Protestant Bible. It's sometimes in an Apocrypha appendix and sometimes excluded, depending on the church. So I also want to thank Donna for turning me on to the Barry Moser version of the Bible. I'm going to try to get a copy of that for my wife.
Can I just mention this? You asked me if I knew Barry Mosher.
Yeah.
Yes, I've met him. He's shaken my hands, but I'm acquainted with the man, but I don't know how many people really know him. You can also almost physically feel it, the wall, not exactly a wall, but a certain boundary when you meet him. And I'm not sure, maybe it's part of the whole New England tradition of boundaries and stone walls and all that. But yeah, he was very courteous, shook my hand. I talked with him. He happened to be shown at a Michelson's gallery in Northampton, which we frequented very often. But and I lived down the road from him, but I wouldn't exactly say we were friendly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
You've met
was
him.
in awe of the man. Okay.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
Yes. I appreciate it. Yeah,
Okay.
it's he's a hell of an artist. Anyone who hasn't seen his work, it's worth Googling. Barry
Plus,
Moses.
he's the craftsman, and that Penny Royal Press is probably one of the longest in existence. I mean, they don't that those kind of presses don't last long
Right.
usually.
Right.
He's amazing. Him, Leonard Baskin, who was his mentor at the Kahina Press, amazing things. Kahina is no longer in existence, but Pennyroyal still is. So
Yeah.
anyway, I just wanted to qualify that. I don't know that we were ever friendly. I was just in awe of the man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the clarification. So yeah, it's a natural thing that's going to happen, as we go through these conversations, is we're going to get some stuff right and some stuff wrong. But the advantage of having a recurring seminar is we can always, look it up in between and come back the next time and say, "Whoa, my bad, Ecclesiastes is in the Bible. It's Ecclesiasticus that's sometimes apocryphal, sometimes excluded." Um, so also called the Book of Sirach is Sirach, is Ecclesiasticus. Zelig, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, Rick, go ahead. I'll make my point on the text. So address the ecclesiastical point first. That'll be perfect.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I mostly just brought those up just to correct the error. And otherwise, I'm inclined to just go on to paragraph 8 and then paragraph 9. We can move on through this. So Kenneth Smith in paragraph 7 and 8 is making this distinction between theism and deism. And as a general reminder, theism is a belief in a personal divinity you have a personal relationship with, that can be thought of as a being with a character and a personality. And we talked about how the term parousia, originally meant, it referred to the way that deities are, in the ancient world, the conception of deities is that they are with us, they are in us, we are possessed by them. And of course, as aspects of nature, we are also inside of them. There's an interpenetration. That was the original meaning of parousia. But the transition from the ancient epoch and its worldview to the medieval epoch and its worldview included not just development or evolution or gradual accumulation of changes, but also a deliberate program of redefining key terms in Latin that was carried out by the church fathers. They went through all of the key terms from ancient philosophy and ancient cultural value systems, and they redefined them to to tie them to their own theology, their emerging kind of orthodox structured theology. You know, they went for several centuries. They were trying to get rid of the many side by side variants of Christianity, because Christianity started out with many variants, and they're trying to weld it by hook or by crook into a single, you know, kind of orthodox position with enough members in it that they could be a force. You know, they could affect the direction of politics and eventually take over the empire. But to do that, they had to not only drive out the others, they had to establish a canon for which books are in and which ones are out. They had to drive away or put an end to the practice that had been going on for centuries of these kind of wild-eyed desert prophets who said they had a personal relationship with God and they had just had visions and they were going to come tell you about their visions and tell you what God said. And this really pissed off the orthodoxy because, you know, who knew what those guys were going to say from one day to the next. You know, God, it would change from week to week or month to month, and that wasn't giving them a solid foundation for their orthodoxy. So they went through and they edited the Gospels and they edited the epistles to change what people said, because Paul was from an era where there were, you know, visionaries all the time, and he was sharing the names of visionaries and saying you should listen to these people, they're all wise. And they had to go in there and insert. They forged some letters that they claimed were by Paul. They added some letters that they said were by people who knew Paul, and they tampered with the Gospels. And all of this was designed to say about those crazy visionaries who were always talking to God. We had 12 of them, maybe 13 if you add Paul in, but there won't be any more. That's done with now. Now you have to listen to the church hierarchy, and the church hierarchy will tell you what God wants. No more people coming from the desert or the outskirts of society and shaking up our theology. We can't have that anymore. So they're pushing down the visionaries and prophets. They're pushing aside the variant books and trying to establish a canon. And as part of that, they're also trying to pin down and standardize the theology. You know, what is the structure? What is the triumvirate of God? How does that work? You know, every time they talk about these things, it's causing numerous arguments, and they're trying to get all the arguments settled. They're having councils in which they're saying, okay, these 15 possible interpretations of what it means to be a three-in-one God, these 15 are not okay. Only this one is okay. These other 15 have to go. So all of that's happening in the first 4 centuries over and over. There's an enormous amount of, and this is part of what Kenneth is alluding to in paragraph 7 and 8 when he's talking about the fact that Christianity has, in its early medieval form, it has welded together this theistic notion of God, which predates the medieval epoch and goes back to the heart of ancient religion. This idea that God is in us and we are in God, and, you know, very personal, with this deistic religion. And the deistic religion is saying, no, God's not going to appear to you in visions anymore. I mean, unless you're a saint, and you're not, so shut up. But, you know, he's not going to appear in visions to you anymore. So don't you come to us and tell us that God gave you a personal, you know, revelation that you're now going to share with us. We don't want to hear it. He doesn't do that anymore. He did that before. We've written them down. We're done with that stage now. Now is the stage where you do what you're told. And of course, as we all know if those of you who know anything about the history of the medieval period already know, and those of you who don't will find out in the 2 years ahead. This attempt to put an end to visionaries and say, okay, the church now has a monopoly on the sources of information about God didn't work out so well for the orthodoxy. The medieval epoch, as much as it can be characterized by a strong central religious empire that's trying to standardize and drive out all the alternatives, it's also characterized by a relentless flowering of visionaries. They're just cropping up over the next 1,000 years, left, right, and center. And sometimes the church can get rid of them, and sometimes they can't. And the church has to say, I guess we'll make you a saint. And sometimes the saints catch on during their own lifetimes, even though they're not canonized as saints during their lifetimes, generally speaking. But sometimes these visionaries catch on so much that large populations of Christians start to follow them, and then the church is stuck. They can't just like get rid of them because there's too many of them, and they'll be cutting off their own arm or leg. And so whenever that happens, they start a monastic order. They say, okay, Benedict, you can be the weirdo, but you're going to be the weirdo in this monastic order. And all the people who like you, they can all be Benedictines, and we're just going to, you know, this is your place to do that sort of thing. We'll be the main church over here, and we acknowledge that you're in the church, but you're also not in the church because, you know, only the people who take the oaths to be a Benedictine are going to count. And they kept thinking that, you know, if they just did one or two of these, they'd be done. But as we know from the history, there's many orders, many monastic orders, many orders of nuns. They keep cropping up over and over because the idea of a theistic God who is directly relating to you and sharing visions of a better world can't be stamped out, no matter how much force the orthodoxy tries to bring to bear on the problem. It can't be done. They can't get rid of the lingering threads of that ancient concept of theistic deities who are present. So there is this tug of war. Can you have a personal relationship with God, or do you need a priest to interpret for you? Can you have a personal relationship with the scripture, or do you need a priest to interpret for you? You know, all of these things have to do with how close is God to you, how theistic is God, versus how distant is God from you, a deistic God. And the ultimate in deistic gods is a God who winds up the universe at the beginning according to and sets its laws of nature in motion, and then stands back at a distance and doesn't intervene anymore. No more miracles, no more visions. The universe just chugs along like clockwork. And you can see how that is a logical extension of the enormous amount of effort that the church put into trying to stop personal revelation and visions, right? You're trying to push theism away, but the risk is if you push it too far away, then there's no room left for miracles. So what the orthodoxy is trying to do is walk a tightrope between these positions that allows them to stay in charge. They're still relevant because God does still intervene. He just intervenes through the church or through the Pope. But he won't intervene directly through you most of the time, so don't you rock the boat. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. The church is going to take care of you, and you need to not mess with it too much. And the whole time that it's trying to chart that middle path, the easier to explain concepts of theism and deism are each tugging in its direction, because they're more coherent. They may not explain reality as well. They might or they might not. But regardless of that, and also they might not be what the orthodoxy wants, neither extreme deism nor extreme theism, but they're easier to understand. So people exposed to the theology, the complicated, welded together theology of the medieval church, a certain percentage of them are just going to end up pushing all the way over to theism or pushing all the way over to deism because they're more coherent positions to hold. So this is what he's alluding to. There's a tug of war. So, all right, thank you for that. So let's go to Hans. Zelig, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, Rick. Yeah, well, what's interesting is reading what the text for today, and there is this tension that Kenneth brings up about, is God a free, inconsistent person, liable to reverse? Like, the fundamental question is, if God is good, then why the evil? You see that in the Old Testament. God reveals himself to Moses, and then he wants to destroy Moses because he doesn't circumcise his child, and his wife is opposing him. And what's interesting is that theologians have understood that God enters into his creation and interacts with it, and interacts in such a way that it's authentic. And at the same time, there's also this aspect of the biblical God where, according to the scriptures, like for example in Acts 4:27, it says that he had predetermined the death of Jesus beforehand. And it's a text that goes back to the chapter of Isaiah. And so in this sense, you have early on in the early church in the book of Acts, it's the story of Acts, saying that God, and this is going to Isaiah 53, had preordained the death of Jesus as part of his plans to redeem this people. And then within the Christian theology, the greatest sin that could ever exist is the death of the Son of God, who was the only one who has been sinless and perfect. And so within when one looks at that text, then one is looking that God had preordained the greatest sin to happen in human history, and yet he's still holy, right? And so theologians have written many theses upon how can God ordain the greatest sin in the universe, such as the death of Jesus, and yet still remain holy. And so once we realize that the death of Jesus creates the greatest problem for Christianity in the sense of the question of if God is good, then why did Jesus die? Um, then one can see that the biblical concept of predestination that Calvin, sorry, that Calvin came to give conscious form to in the Reformation plays a key role to the medieval response to the ancient question that Lucretius under kind of the atheism of the Greek world, where if God is all powerful, why doesn't he stop evil? Then that would mean that he's impotent, or he's not impotent, but he doesn't want to stop evil, therefore God is evil, right? And so, and then within the Christian biblical tradition, when we read Acts, there is a revelation there that God can decree evil. He can decree such as the horrible death of the perfect Son of God, um, and still be holy. How does he perfectly carry that out? The scripture doesn't really explain that to us, but it does say there is sort of a relationship there that God is in control of good and evil and remains holy. And so in that sense, it's kind of like what we see in the text, how does God stay as a free agent without being in error, right? And I think the Reformation through Calvinism was a response to that question. How does he stay holy? How does he not become kind of a demiurge or a demon? And so, and in that sense, when you bring about also the topic of the canon, right? It's the same question for the Old Testament. Who said what books were in the Old Testament? If when we study Jewish history, there is no council that ever decided what was the Old Testament. Like no council. It wasn't until 500 AD that there was an official Jewish council to decide what books would be in the Jewish canon. But before that, there was no council to decide what was in the Old Testament. And yet we find Jesus telling the Pharisees, um, you've heard it said since Abel to Zacharias, which was a way to summarize Genesis to Chronicles, because the Jewish Bible, the way that is organized, it starts in Genesis and ends in the book of Chronicles. That's the way that it's organized, as opposed to the biblical, the Christian Protestant Bible, which begins in Genesis and ends in the Old Testament begins in Genesis and ends in Malachi, and then Matthew, John start and go on. Um, and in that sense, Jesus knew of a canon already. He knew the Genesis to Chronicles, or what is known as the Tanakh, was to be accepted as word from God. But yet there was never a council that formally decided. And so that same question was, how did the Old Testament become canonized? And then the New Testament became canonized kind of in the same way, where miracles backed up the apostles. It was accepted by many different communities or churches. And when we understand that, we run into the same problems as the Old Testament. Like Moses was opening the Red Sea, and there comes a moment when no one opens the Red Sea anymore. There's no more prophets like Moses. They're not doing great miracles. And there's a moment of silence as well, like after the book of Daniel, like in 500 BCE till the first common era, there is no miracles. The Jewish people realize that God is not speaking. God is kind of hidden. What's going on? And and it's interesting because that's kind of in the era we're in, that God is not speaking or revealing himself through prophets or seers of visions. But
Yes.
then there's something interesting though in the book of John. This is the last thing I'm going to say. And in the book of John, Jesus, Thomas, doubting Thomas, right? Um, Jesus appears himself to the apostles, the gospel tells us. And Thomas is like, nope, I'm not gonna believe you guys. You guys are having like some kind of weird schizophrenic vision or whatever. And and Jesus appears himself in the midst of the apostles, and he tells Thomas, okay, Thomas, you wanted to see me and touch my wound, put your finger in my wound, come and do it. And then Jesus says, more blessed are those who believe and do not see than those who see. And so it really does change the narrative of a faith based on seeing prophets or Moses opening the Red Sea or resurrections is not as great as those that don't see. And so there's kind of like you kind of turn that upside down, and it's like, oh, so you're telling us that we shouldn't be looking for signs, but we should be having faith in things we don't see.
Right.
Huh, that's
Right.
amazing. And so that kind of like transports us into this idea of a religion that even in today's world where we don't believe in miracles, it's kind of like the most relevant. Like we're in the times where we don't see anything. So according to Jesus, whoever believes in this era is more blessed than the
Yes.
people that saw in apostles or in
Yes.
Jesus's days. So that's amazing. So that's kind of what makes me think of with the discussion that we're having today.
Thank you, Zelig. And thanks for focusing on that because, I mean, what we're going to find is that the specific orthodoxy that the medieval church settled on put it in an unstable position. And in that unstable position, the text, the history, the populations of Christians in the world and their different ideas, they're massive. And I'm going to quote Stephen here, there are massive centrifugal forces kind of suggesting that it should fly apart into a bunch of different religions. But the orthodoxy, the sort of religious empire at the center of it, is doing everything they can to try to prevent that from happening. And they're trying to figure out how can they apply enough centripetal force to hold together this very complicated melange of different ideas. And in the course of that, there are a number of just complete revolutions from the ancient way of seeing to the medieval way of seeing. And one of you put your finger on right there, which is this idea that it would be hard to be an ancient atheist because Poseidon is the sea. He's not some dude somewhere else who claims to be in charge of the sea. He is the sea. If you say you don't believe in Poseidon, you're saying you don't believe there's an ocean, and all your fellow villagers will just chuck you off the end of the dock and you fall in the water and they say, well, then why are you wet? If there's no Poseidon, then why are you wet? Demeter, the goddess of the crops and the fields and the harvest, anybody can see the trees putting out the fruit, that can see the wheat growing. I mean, everything, these deities don't require faith. They might require theology to explain what you're seeing, but it don't require faith per se. And it's one of the aspects of ancient religion that it's very hard for modern people to see because we're so used to 1,000 years of the medieval religion. So, and Stephen asks a good question about where the fish notice they're wet. Maybe the fish don't worship Poseidon. Maybe the fish are in Poseidon. I don't know. But you could sort of see the massive change that happens in John, where we've gone all the way to saying to believe because the evidence is right in front of your eyes, which is how everybody used to believe for 1,700 years or 1,200 years or however long the ancient epoch was. It's not as blessed. To be really blessed, you have to believe without evidence. You have to, now the focus shifts from what is the most obvious explanation of what's right in front of us, which is, the attempt, that's how ancient religions try to structure themselves. It's now changing to what explanation is there no evidence at all for, but that you have to believe anyway. So the focus becomes on constructing faith in the absence of evidence, or worse, constructing faith in the presence of absence to the contrary. There may be evidence, if evidence crops up that suggests that your belief system is wrong, then you have to reject that evidence. You have to, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, is the way people express that. And we see traces of that into the modern epoch of the will to believe, the will to to stamp one's view of the world onto the world and insist that the world works not the way that it works, but the way I say it works, the way I want to believe that it works. You can see the seeds of this modern thing going on in John 2029, where we're talking about, can you overcome the evidence in front of you and maintain your faith?
And let me add this as well, Rick. Like in even the Jewish epoch, the Israeli epoch, had it in their visionaries, like in Jeremiah, where God appears to him because he flees from the Baal prophets, the god of the storm, right? That's who Baal was. It was like the Canaanite version of Zeus. Um, and in that passage in Jeremiah, God reveals himself in such a way that he makes it known that he is not the storm, he is not the wind, he is not the earthquake, he is not the fire. He's independent of that. And that, to be reading that in the times of when people believe that Baal, the ancient view of Zeus, of the god of the storm, is the storm, it was completely revolutionary. And in Jeremiah, a very ancient text that even appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was already portraying that idea that that Yahweh is not the storm. He causes the storm, he causes the earthquake, he causes the tornadoes, but he is none of those. That's revolutionary.
It is. It is. And this is one of those places where our understanding of the epochs and their worldviews has to be not mechanical, just lines on a timeline. It has to be organic, so we can see the roots growing long before the tree emerges from the soil, if you will. These the ancient Hebrew religion did not exist in order to produce the medieval Christian religion. First of all, let's get that out of the way. It existed for its own reasons, but it existed in antagonism to the polytheism that was around it. It was an anti-ancient way of seeing the world. Even though it occurred during the ancient epoch, it was hostile to the dominant ancient worldview because it presupposed this idea, like you say, of a God who doesn't have to be the storm to be in charge of the storm. It's a massive change. It's basically incompatible with the Babylonian religion, with the Roman religion, the Greek religion, and so on. It doesn't fit. And Christianity builds off of that and grows out of that and continues that tradition and comes into its own when it's able to replace the ancient religion and the ancient systems of power. So very interesting stuff going on here with the interpenetration of one epoch into another. The roots of the next epoch are already growing before the old epoch ends. And we got to assume that's happening now. Somewhere in the world around us is the next epoch, already growing, already around us, but we can't tell because we don't have the hindsight of history. So we can't tell which of these things is going to grow into the something new and which is not. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have a really kind of different uh, analysis of this, and that's and I'm glad you explained the relationship between theism and deism. But I always thought, well, the dimension you added that it was really a structural political situation, and that was inherited from the Romans because they have to rule an empire, right? So therefore, in a sense, it had to somehow jive with that because they want. Remember, with Charlemagne, it's the it's the new empire, which is really, in some sense, encapsulated in the religion, the synthesis between the church and and the state. And so, and my thought was that the way I interpret deism previously, and I still do, but this added dimension of the maintaining of the empire of the Romans in synthesis with theism, is it. My interpretation is I always thought theism was not so much the change from the inner to the outer, but that God had was withdrawing from the universe, and therefore we were left to mankind to figure out what it was, and that goes back to the Garden of Eden, because man ate the fruit of knowledge. He knows something, and to give the optimistic view of this is that God threw him out. He said, "Well, now that you have knowledge, you have the free will to be on your own and figure it out yourself, because you're the only one beings that are free to figure out what there is." And the paradigm of that deism is Newton, the picture of Newton, uh, the painting of Newton using the compass to draw out the diagrams of the universe that God had left the traces of, right? And so that was really a continuation. And it really gave birth, in a sense, figuring it out yourself, to a kind of modernity, is mankind's responsibility to figure out what God meant, because God has withdrawn from the world. I mean, and he withdrawn because he's given us the freedom, because we've done it to ourselves, the freedom to find our own way. But he didn't do it in an evil way. I mean, after all, he did give us free will, and that, and in a sense, we ate from the tree of knowledge. We have to figure ourselves. And I always tie that in relation to somebody like John Locke, for instance, somebody that I find appealing, but I also find that there was problems as well. The thing that got me upset about John Locke was that he says the American Indians, they still live in Eden. They do not belong east of Eden, which is where we belong. Uh, they live on the land, and they use the land, but they never work the land. So they do not have ownership of the land, because in order to really own the land, you have to work on it and improve it in your way, right? So I thought that was horrendous, but nonetheless, that was, in a sense, something emerged from deism in its own way, right? Because we have developed these laws, these rules, these way of, you know, dividing the land that is east of Eden. And since the natives are still living in Eden, they're going to have to learn the proper way of being in the world. So my thought is that, yeah, we were given this freedom, but and this responsibility of figuring out what the universe is about, the cosmic order is about. But because we don't have divine understanding, we do make mistakes, such as colonialism, as such. So that's my interpretation of how it actually gave way from the medieval to the modern era, because now it's our responsibility to talk about the movement of the stars and the heavens and the Big Bang and all of that, as well as the government that rules the world and divide the lands, and and all that. And so in a funny way, you could say deism actually validated colonialism in a funny way. Okay, it's a mistaken world, but we make mistakes. We're human beings. So hopefully we could just work our way out of that, but nonetheless, it was a validity to colonialism, which is I find a little bit overdoing it, and maybe we could back out of that. But that's the way I look at it, because we have the responsibility now to take care and live in the world in the correct way. And the
Yes.
beginning of the correct way is colonialism. That's it. That's my interpretation, which is a different from, the inner and outer thing in relationship to the
Yes.
religion itself. But it actually gave birth to science in a funny way.
Yes.
So that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I'm gonna only briefly mention the modern stuff. Certainly John Locke, yes. Also Thomas Jefferson
Yeah.
explicitly cites John Locke and uses it as a justification for slaughtering the indigenous people. And interestingly, one of the popes puts out announcements. Now, this is, of course, we're out of the medieval period now. We're talking about the modern period. One of the popes puts out an announcement a few centuries back saying, people who are not Christians can't own land. So even though there are no Christians in North and South America, all of that land is ours. We can just take it because they're not Christian. Now we can teach them to be Christian and then give them back part of the land to work on as Christians, and then they can sort of own it, or at least they can rent it from the church. But it's okay for us to take everything because they weren't Christian. Now that doctrine of discovery that it gets to count as us finding it if the people who were already there weren't Christians. This is just the flip side of John Locke's position that they don't deserve to keep the land because they didn't work it the way we would like them to have worked it. And both the secular side and the religious side have arrived at the same conclusion by entirely different realms of thinking, which shows you that the sequence of thought was not the important part. That was just the fig leaf, over the erection. The important part was the conclusion. How do we take all this? Since we can take all this stuff, we've got all the guns and ships and things. How do we rationalize taking all this stuff so that we can still sleep at night? And we can, on the one hand, say, well, we're saving their souls, and that's the important thing. No matter how many tens of millions of them die, at least we saved their souls. Or on the other hand, we can say, well, the important thing is modern scientific, technological, productive capacity of the land, and that has to be maximized. I mean, how can you not maximize? It's not scientific not to maximize it. So, if we have to, slaughter a few savages in order to allow modern civilized people to, to exploit the land, well, then that's a small price to pay.
No, it's not so much as sleeping at night. It's a matter of justice. This is the just way.
Yeah. So the point is, we've got two different sets of rationalizations, and you might think that the Jesus described in Mark, Matthew, and Luke was pretty clear about tending to the disadvantaged, not exploiting this disadvantage. He doesn't run around, screwing over prostitutes and lepers and poor people. He helps them. And so you would think that it's pretty obvious that what's expected of Christians in the New World is to be kind and loving towards their brethren who they've just discovered on these two continents. But this is showing the arc of change from the beginning of the medieval epoch to the end of the medieval epoch. We talked about how the beginning starts in rebellion against the corruption of the ancient epoch and its failure to meet its promises. And the great irony of the medieval epoch is that by the time we get to the end, they're failing to meet their promises. And even the most obvious promises. They're doing what couldn't possibly be interpreted as, legitimately as anything other than a deep violation of everything Jesus stood for, and claiming that God is, justifying it for them. And this is the kind of massive incompatibility that drives revolutions. And you get the modern epoch arising. Get Martin Luther and his theses nailed to the church door in reaction against this. This is intolerable. This is too awful to allow it to continue. I don't care if you excommunicate me. I don't care if you burn me at the stake. This sucks too bad. When you drive people to that point, that's when your epoch ends. They got no reason to keep investing in the old way, because the old way is so oppressive and so hypocritical and so corrupt. And of course, the many people in the various modern Catholic churches would argue that what happens in the change from the medieval epoch to the modern epoch was good for the medieval church because it allowed them to throw out the corruption. It compelled them to confront the problems that they had in the 1300s and 1400s and 1500s and say, if we want to survive as a church, we've got to clean house. This has got to come to a stop. And so, it wasn't just about the good churches spawn off from the bad church and leave it behind. It was about a transformation in both the original church and the new churches that grew out of it. The main thing, though, I wanted to take us back to is away from the modern epoch and back to the medieval, and to look at this question of, when faith is mostly a private matter or a family matter or a clan matter or a tribal matter, then you can have differences of theology without a giant explosion resulting. Like in the Greek world and the Roman world, there were enormous differences between different families and different tribes and how they worshiped even the same deities, let alone different ones. And you can do that because it's nobody else's business, right? I mean, these are your family and tribal customs that go back centuries or thousands of years. The way that religion was organized in the ancient world was at that level. When it was organized at a larger level, at the level of the polis or the league among the Greeks, or then later at the level of the empire among the Romans, the only way that they could hold together their polis or their league or their empire was to continue to respect the diversity and localization of religion and say, if we don't want a big fight, we let the tribes keep practicing their own rites and rituals, right? That's what we do. We may make some of them official, but not obligatory, right? We may just recognize them and put them on the calendar. And it's like sharing in a city the way that people share, the flyers. There's going to be a interesting, carnival this Saturday down at the farmers market. We're going to have this event, at the Seattle Center. All these things we're sort of sharing them so that people who are interested can come, but we're not mandating them and saying people who don't come are going to burn at the stake, or we're going to send an army to kill you for not coming. So this is what happens when orthodoxy versus non-orthodoxy is kept low key, right? You're able to have that level of you're able to not have fight wars over religion, which is the model in the ancient world. No fighting wars over religion. But in the medieval world, because they're combining politics and theology to make a religious empire, now theology and people's adherence to it becomes a matter of political power. They have to get people to believe the orthodoxy. They can't let them spin off, because if they let the theology spin off, then the politics and the economy, the political economy, spins off with it because they've united them. If the political economy spins off, now you're losing money and you might fight a war. So they have to do everything they can to avoid that fissioning, which means they're trying to stamp out diversity and localization of religion. They're trying to make it an orthodoxy and a standard that everybody has to follow. But because the way it begins is by welding together incompatible different belief systems, 15 different versions of Christianity welded together, putting a single brand name over the top of it, but still internally containing these disagreements and differences, and these very carefully structured reconciliations and compromises in the theology, like the specific nature of the three-in-one God of the medieval church, as opposed to all the other variants of how you could pull that off. This is the one you're supposed to believe. That sort of thing inherently prods people, it motivates them, it stimulates them against it. Because if it was just your private religion and it contained incoherencies, nobody would care. It's your private business. But when you make it the business of an entire continent and attempt to make it the business of the entire world, now everybody cares. Which means every mistake that you've made, every seam, every scar, every weld, every incompatibility, you've got an entire world population looking at it going, hey, that doesn't make sense. And so all your mistakes get blown up large, not just in their consequences, like the way that the Greek tragedians meant, not just that bad things happen as a result, But specifically, you generate your own opposition by turning the pressure up to 11 to say you all have to conform. But they're all saying, so they know their soul is in peril, right? Conform or die, conform or burn in hell. And yet, how can I conform to this thing that's incoherent? Look at these problems. These two things can't go together. If you're supposed to love poverty and take care of the poor, why do you have piles of gold that you're just sitting on and dressing up in and using in ceremonies? Why aren't you distributing that to the poor? These questions, all of these things just explode out of the pressure cooker of the attempt to create a religious empire. It's a natural consequence. There's another way I'd like to put it. I think I'll call on Stephen in just a second, but there's a point here I'm sort of trying to that Kenneth made that I'm trying to articulate a little differently about the tension between deism and theism. It's not just that people rebel against the incoherency, because it's not everybody is born a troublemaker, right? Some people are moderators, they're mediators. They want to make the peace. They want things to work. In fact, lots of people want things to work. And so what you get is a lot of people who study the theology, they see the problems, and then they try to fix it. They try to find a way to make the pieces work together as a whole. They try to keep it from falling apart. And so you're not just generating opposition, you're also it's a creative ferment. When you have a system that's full of interesting parts and promise, but has internal incoherencies, incompatibilities, what it does is it naturally generates a gigantic creative ferment. And I'm going to use a very secular example. You all heard of Dungeons and Dragons, the role-playing game where people pretend to be heroes who fight monsters, right? This has been around for 50, 60 years now, depending on where you cite the beginning. The very first books that were published for Dungeons and Dragons were cheap Xeroxed, stapled together booklets that they gradually wrote and put together in a box. And because it was just these are the things that our gaming groups do, and we've written the rules down to share them with other people so they can do it too, it started this giant creative ferment. And it was written, they actually said in the books, our job isn't to tell you that there's only one way to do things. Any way that's fun is a fine way to play. This is just some stuff to get you started. We're trying to, give you some shortcuts. But by all means, every different gaming group should go through and tailor the rules to their own purposes. Maybe this particular part of the game isn't fun for you. You throw that out. Maybe there's some other part of the game that's fun for you that we didn't think of. We'll add that in. And so let 1,000 flowers bloom, as Mao Zedong said earlier. Go ahead and diversify. Let a lot of creativity fly. So the result was, in the 70s and 80s, there was an explosion of role-playing rule systems, right? And they had this spirit of, this is what it means to be a gamer. We're all creating together, and we're all making variants on each other, and we all support each other's right to do that. What does this sound like? This sounds like Paul talking about the visionaries who have direct communion with God. And there could be a lot of visionaries, and they've all got their channels to God. And each of them might be having different conversations with God, and God might have different things that the only way you're going to find out about it is to talk to that visionary. You might need to visit a lot of different visionaries. Dilate your mind to be ready for this whole world of possibilities. But in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, the company that started Dungeons and Dragons, TSR, was looking around at all these different companies making all this money from all these different variant role-playing games. And they're like, man, we've made a mistake, because that money should be in our pockets. We invented Dungeons and Dragons. How come all these other people are making money? We should fix that problem. So we're going to start writing books that say, be sure to buy official TSR Dungeons and Dragons products. Don't settle for any of that hogwash nonsense that all these crazy diversified people are making. None of that's as good as the official. We've tested our stuff. Our stuff is better and stronger. And so there became this backlash against their own earlier culture as they attempted to collect more people and more revenue and generate more power. The political economy of Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, in other words, turned against what was the creative culture of Dungeons and Dragons in the early 70s when they invented it. And it was a natural consequence. So there is a critique that arose in the late 90s and early 2000s about that and what happened. And it noted the following. When your system of ideas is wholly coherent, people can either take it or leave it, but it doesn't generate the kind of creative ferment that it does when your system of ideas is intriguing, fascinating, full of great stuff, but also incoherent. If it's intriguing but incoherent, it invites people to rise to the occasion of trying to solve the problems. They empower themselves creatively to engage with the material and try to fix it. They become creators themselves. And the result is, a giant flourishing of enthusiasm and a spread of the ideas. Even though they were incoherent, they spread because it's exciting to be in the presence of something that's not just mechanically laid down as law from the beginning, but is instead clearly in some sort of state of growth that needs more help. Maybe it needs help from us. Maybe we can help. Maybe we get engaged. That's what I see when I look at Christianity under Paul versus Christianity, in the medieval sense. Because under Paul, you have this incredible ferment and all these house churches and people traveling from house to house and sharing their visions of God and Jesus and what does it all mean for us in the world and how should we live. But by the time you get past that into the attempt to create a religious empire, now you're at we can't have any of that. We can't have a whole bunch of creators. There needs to be only one source of truth, and we're the source of truth, and the rest of you need to shut up and just say what we say. And the result is, it generates that same kind of struggle for the same reasons. The incoherency itself, combined with the fascinating, intriguing ideas, is like a powder keg of creativity. Stephen, sorry to keep you waiting so long. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
No, there's no problem there. We're on to 100 and something or other. There's a lot of time involved. I was at a lecture last week where you had an atheist condemning God for all the crimes in the Bible he did. But there's a danger. It's a bit ridiculous. So, if you have an idea that you got a God, which, remember, the ancient Hebrews started saying was all powerful, was not only that, but was the source of all good and all evil. This is the one God you got to worry about. Forget about the others. This is the God that dominates everything, both good and evil. But it's as though the atheists and the humanists take that concept and are eternally holding God to a standard above him. Now, this is the thing. This God, according to the tradition, is the creativity out of nothing. All good, all evil is this God. Now, you got something like the Manichaeans, the Zoroastrian sort of concepts where you have two gods, one's good and one is evil, and they're both fighting over the universe, so to speak. Well, that was heresy. That's saying that there's an equally powerful evil God to the one God that created all. And it just doesn't seem to get through to people who think that this argument works when he goes and wipes out the firstborn of Egypt. And the point is, if you went around killing babies without a just cause, you're the sinner. But the Lord is always his own just cause. He's the source of justice. There is no justice beyond him. It's a bit like I was listening to one of Kenneth Smith's yesterday, and he was pointing out the ancient Greeks didn't have a concept of empty space that went on forever as the blank page of the universe, as a vast expanse which you wrote things on. For the Greeks, substance and space went together. So if you take away substance, there is no form, there is no space. This is the point that Kenneth was trying to make. But the modern mind has abstracted things so much that it conceives of a vast, empty, nihilistic space which dominates everything. And so, yeah, I just query people. You have to really think about this bit of eternally coming up with the idea that this supposed God, which is all powerful, can be judged by an external set of standards. Now, Rick, you're getting into Aquinas. I think he was the one that was trying to deal with these difficult questions. Another thing I'll add, another thing here, now this situation with this council of 869 was the condemnation that humans have an additional soul above their rational soul. Unlike the animals, humans were given a rational soul. But I can't chase it up. They condemned the idea that there were two souls in a human, that there was a soul beyond the rational soul. So here was where the Western Church seemed to have, I've heard that they erased the spirit from the tricked army of man. Man from now on, as far as the Western Church was concerned, was just body and soul, whereas the Eastern Church retained the tradition of body, soul, and spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, theodicy, right? The problem of evil. It's not a problem if your gods aren't all good and all powerful, right? I mean, the polytheistic deities of the ancient world weren't all good and they weren't all powerful. So it's easy to explain evil. It's not a problem. You don't have to, your gods don't get put in the crosshairs. I mean, you can under the right circumstances, but they're not forced into the crosshairs by the structure of the theology. But as soon as you start throwing infinity around, all good, all powerful, omnipresent, you wreck your math. It always happens. If you start adding infinity or dividing by zero, you wreck your math. You wreck your arithmetic. And it happens with theology. So the moment the medieval conception, the medieval Christian conception of God as all powerful and all knowing and all good creates the problem of, well, then where does evil come from? Because we can all, as the Buddha says, we all experience suffering. It can't all be for our own good, horrible parasites infesting our children, there's not for their own good, or a traffic accident, your kid gets run over, that's not for the good. It's obviously not for the good. You take some real ideological work to say, somehow this was part of a good plan. And that's not a problem the ancients have. It's like, yeah, shit happens. But it's a problem the medievals have because they've turned God up to 11. The all good and all infinite suddenly presents this difficulty. And the struggle to reconcile that theology, which you're told to believe on pain of, either being killed or eternal torment in hell or both, to reconcile that with reality where bad things happen is it puts people into a bind emotionally and cognitively. And for this reason, it is a natural thing for people to spin out of this weird, delicate, arbitrary balancing act that is the Orthodox medieval position, and to spin out of that off to some version of the two gods, the one good and the one evil, to have the devil rise up as a counterforce so that God can, if not, so that you can say that God is still all good. God is worth worshiping because the evil things aren't his fault, they're this other guy's fault. And then to reconcile that with God being all powerful, people have a variety of strategies, but they come up with them. To this day, people come up with them. It's like, why, how, maybe it's part of a plan. Maybe it has to unfold in this way. Maybe there's something about human free will that they patch around it to try to make the two God version work, the binary gods. But of course, the binary gods are a heresy. And there's people, as we study the history, there's people are going to be punished for this set of ideas repeatedly, because the orthodoxy feels that it takes away from God's power. The desire to have God be all powerful so that he can be better than the old ancient gods is so strong that they're willing to take away the most obvious explanation of where evil comes from in the world and go back to, it's not for us to know, his plan is inevitable, just deal with it, he's all good, but evil things aren't his fault, so suck it up is sort of the official orthodox position. It's a mystery, you're not supposed to think about that too hard.
Well, you have to have the 100% God.
Yes.
Because otherwise there's always a risk with your salvation. You could be a perfectly deserving salvation, but there's a little glitch in the system because your God is not all powerful.
Right.
And you've gone into damnation, even though you deserve salvation.
Yeah.
Fortunately, God says, "Oh, sorry, there's been a glitch in the system."
Yes. That's right. Yeah, I mean, you nailed it, Stephen. Right? That's the issue. It's once you present the value proposition that the real importance here is eternity, and it's heaven or hell, then God had better be 100% powerful, because he better be able to keep his promise that you're not going to go to hell if you do the right thing. And if God's not 100% powerful, it raises the risk you might end up in hell and not belong there. It's scary. It's too scary to think about. So, yeah. All right. So anyway, so this is the theme that we're running around over and over today. We'll work our way through the hands next. But the theme we're working our way through over and over is that this incompatibility between deism and theism, and yet having them welded together into the orthodoxy of the medieval church theology, is an example of a whole bunch of other incompatibilities that got into the orthodox position the same way, by pulling together disparate early Christian groups that the church felt like they couldn't dispense with either one of them. They needed them both to join the orthodoxy, so they crafted the orthodoxy to allow them both to be there. And when their ideas are incompatible, the only solution is to weld them together and put a wall between them and say, well, sometimes we talk about it this way and that makes the first group happy, and sometimes we talk about it that way and that makes the second group happy, and we try never to say either of those things when both groups are present. We try to basically paper over and say there's certain things we shouldn't talk about, because if we talk about them, it's going to become clear that these are incompatible pieces. But that doesn't stop the next 1,500 years of people speculating to try to to notice these problems and to try to solve them. Zelig, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, going to what you're talking about, melding these ideas together, the medieval epoch, kind of leaving behind the Greek mindset, and we see an instance of that in Paul, in Acts 17, 16 to 34. He encounters the Epicureans and the Stoic philosophers. And the first time they hear him talk about the resurrection in Jesus, they say, "What are these foreign gods you're bringing to us?" Like, they think that the resurrection is a god. It's literally an entity. And the Greek mindset did think about that. They thought about ideas as entities. And here comes Paul bringing in a completely different conception of, like, no, it's not an idea. It's an event. It's an event and a person that came back to life from death, which was completely foreign to the Greek conception that material can come back to life once it's completely corrupted in the literal sense. And then we also see Paul then go to Athens and say, "Hey, I see that you guys are very religious. You guys worship all kinds of deities, and you guys have this altar to this god, to an unknown god." And he utilizes that strategy to say, "This unknown god that you guys have, I'm here to preach to you guys because you guys are ignorant of this unknown God who doesn't live in temples and is not created by human hands." And then he quotes to them Epimenides, which is the conception of the Greek idea for "in him we live and move and have our being." So he had the Greek conception that we are in God and we have our being in God. So he uses the poetics of the Greeks to make a connection with them, connect a Hebrew idea of the ultimate creator, and he does it by utilizing the scrupulousness of the Athenians to want to capture every god possible. And so they put to the unknown God. If there's one we're missing, we honor you to that one. And Paul uses that and he says, I'm here to preach to you that one that you don't know. That's the creator of all the heavens and the earth. It doesn't live in temples or made by hands. And we see that Paul is trying to make a bridge over so that the Epicureans and the Stoics can understand what's going on, and he manages to succeed, as we know in history, that he manages to go throughout the book of Acts, converting a lot of Gentiles to the message of Jesus, and have them understand that it wasn't a foreign God, it wasn't this idea, this entity, but it was actually an event and a person. And so it really does start from there of Paul is the model of going into foreign cultures, finding where they generalize the understanding of God and say that God that you have an intuition for, I come to preach to you. And in that sense, he was able to bring in that kind of that bridge. And so in that sense, what you're talking about coming in and trying to meld it, Paul shows how he did that, without, at least without violence, right? And in the sense with no sword, but with pure argument. As we see that he goes to Athens and he goes and actually debates. So it's by pure debating and persuasion, right? Whereas we see in the later medieval world where it's by the sword. Like you're gonna accept a new religion, Aztecs, otherwise you die. There is no debate, there is no civility whatsoever. It's like by the sword.
Right.
And Paul was completely different than that. Paul did not bring out the sword. He really brought in the argumentation. And
Exactly.
then hearing what Stephen was saying just before that about the conception of the theodicy, right? And I think eventually the medieval world, the ultimate high point was with Luther, where Luther himself said it, that the Protestant Reformation hinged on the question of the will of man, where he responded to Erasmus, a Roman Catholic monk that had written a book on the freedom of the human will, and he responded back with the bondage of the will, where Luther said, yes, man has free will in the sense that man desires to eat food. That itself is a free will. If you desire to not eat food, then you no longer have free will. We should desire human things, and that's a part of our free will. But as far as autonomous will, like God, Luther would said, no, we're not God. We're not autonomous. We are a part of a divine plan that included the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden. And you could cite passages like Acts 4, where I mentioned, where it says, beforehand you planned the death of the Son of God. And in other passages in the Old Testament, it talks about before the creation of the world, Yahweh had this in mind. And so Luther refutes Erasmus by saying that we have ultimate autonomous free will, and that is what carried on the Protestant Reformation on and forward. And when you have the Reformed, and then you have the different denominations in Protestantism, that really come down to the debate of whether man has autonomous free will or he doesn't. And one of the books that in my opinion really has come to answer the question of, um, how can God be good when like the death of Jesus was a part of his plan. It's by a modern scholar called John Piper. That's his dissertation that he wrote, the justification of God. He goes into the Hebrew and into the Koine Greek, and in my opinion, it's probably kind of like the best response from just pure exegeting Paul, Romans 9, where Paul really goes into the details describing how the theodicy and how's that resolved. But I think ultimately the medieval world got itself into problems because it rejected the history that the Old Testament had, of the Jewish heritage and the Jewish roots, And it really, this is my personal opinion, the medieval world really got lost because of his anti-Semitism, and it completely didn't want anything to do with what the Jewish mindset had developed and discovered by thousands of years of reading the Old Testament. And they completely went their own way and tried to figure out uh, questions and problems that had already been addressed in the Talmud or the Midrash, one of the earlier sources of Jewish tradition. And because the medieval culture rejected that and became more anti-Semitic, and they developed horrible Jewish tropes. Um, in my opinion, that's what kind of led them to darkness, where they were trying to reinvent the wheel when they shouldn't have done so. So that's those are my 2 cents.
Thank you, Zelig. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, it's very important to emphasize, when we're talking about the medieval epoch and trying to understand its worldview, that it's not a continuation of the Jewish worldview. It presents itself as the successor or as the real Jews. Because you see that throughout the Gospels. There's a lot of discussion of, are Christians the real Jews, and Jews have somehow failed to understand their own God. So that goes hand in hand with the anti-Semitism. So part of it is structured as an attempt to say that there's continuity. But as you point out, what we actually see when we look at the issues, how do you resolve issues of theodicy, for example, which are just one example out of dozens of issues that have to be addressed. We see, as Ari pointed out a few weeks ago, Jews had and as you mentioned just now, Jews had a long time to work out these problems and come up with a coherent system that makes sense of God and the world and the problem of evil in the world, so that you end up with a coherent theology. And it was a lot of work by a lot of people over a very long time. And so, but the medieval epoch, by saying, well, you can just forget about that stuff. We're the real Jews, and we're going to start over. We're going to carry along the old books, but we're going to interpret them merely as prophecies of Jesus, and as some coloring, and our point is going to be the Gospels and the epistles, and that's going to be the focus. By doing that, they basically threw out all of that sophisticated theology that the Jews had used to solve these problems of theodicy. And that meant that they created for themselves new problems of theodicy that had not been present, among the Jews until they did that. So, this issue haunts the medieval epoch, this problem of good and evil. You see writers left and right, you see theologians, visionaries, monks, nuns, all kinds of people are wrestling with this problem that comes from this sort of rush job patchwork attempt to throw together a theology in order to create a religious empire. A lot of people have noted the conflict between the theology of the religious empire and the teachings of Jesus, and how there's difficulties between them. There's things that are incompatible.
And let me add
We see
that
the
as
same.
well, Rick. Sorry about that. And Paul warns of the anti-Semitism in Romans 11 to the
Yes,
Gentile church. He tells them, "Do not think that you have supplanted the Israeli promises,
yes,
the Jewish promise." He warns them, and that's exactly what they go ahead and do. They think they had replaced the Jewish people, and he warned them in Romans 11, "Do not do that." And they
yes.
went and did that.
And they went and did it, and it caused no end of trouble, right? Because these are difficult questions that really motivate people. You can't patch over the thing by saying, well, don't ask those questions, don't dig too deeply. These are the things that matter to people. When people are suffering, they want an answer. Why am I suffering? Why is this happening? And the answer can't be shut up, God's good, you don't get to ask those questions. It has to be better than that. And the Jews had better answers for those things. But the medieval church didn't. It had real struggles around this problem. And it's part of why you see this kind of centrifugal kind of ferment of creativity of all kinds of different heresies crop up, attempting to make real sense out of this problem that's caused by making God all powerful and all knowing, but also all good. It's a major issue, and it's part of why I'm reluctant to ever use the phrase Judeo-Christian, except when I'm criticizing the phrase. So the Jews have their theology, and the medieval church has its theology, and they're two different theologies. And the Jewish theology it's more internally coherent, right? Their relationship to their God and to evil and to nature, it works better than the medieval one does. The medieval one has problems, and the problems drive the history of the Middle Ages, left, right, and center. It comes up over and over and over again, this big gaping hole in the theology.
It was supposed to be what Paul introduced was it was supposed to be an inside debate because he would go into the synagogues and debate with him as a Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
Paul tells us that he grew up as a Pharisee, was trained up as a Pharisee, and he would go into the synagogues to debate and have this in-family debate about how the Messiah had arrived and the promises were for all those who believed and to the Gentiles as well. And that's what caused the scandal and and eventually it was so much division that Paul was causing that and then you add the political concept on top of that it led to a division where Christianity is no longer seen as a Jewish religion, which fundamentally it's basically a Jewish religion with the idea of a Mashiach, of a promised kingdom and a political leader.
Yeah.
But now, because the Gentiles started to grow much more at a faster rate and they started to assimilate it to their own particular religions. Now, Christianity is more of a European religion, but fundamentally, it was a Jewish it was a Jewish branch that used to congregate in the synagogue every Shabbat, and they
Yeah.
used to celebrate Shabbat.
Yeah.
But eventually, it just led to the separation where now you like you say it causes to some sort of uncomfortableness to say Judeo-Christianity, even though Christianity is a Jewish religion when you go back to the New Testament.
Yes. And I have a bit of an explanation for it that we'll get to. It comes out of what Kenneth says in paragraph 9, but we'll come to that. Let's go through the hands first. Phil, come off mute. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I think I have something that might help in explaining the Christian religion because it really was, in its way, the synthesis between Jerusalem and Athens. Uh, so it wasn't really just like a transformation of the Jewish religion into Christianity, but it was a synthesis of, you know, the Greeks, I would say Athens in particular, and and Jerusalem and the Jewish religion. And what accounted for the synthesis was Plato, but not the true Plato. Pay attention, Donald. Not the true Plato, because what Augustine brought in as Plato was Platonism or Neoplatonism or Plotinus, which was already, in a sense, got a mystic kind of origin about transcendence. I think Plato's forms were never about transcendence. It was about aspiration for humanity to go further and further. And the forms were always incomplete. He never explained what the forms were. They were just the forms. And so therefore it was just a human thing that transformed God, and I'll say this, to logos, right? I mean, if you look at the original Hebrew Bible, well, I don't read Hebrew, but the original Old Testament, God did not create the universe out of nothing. There was God and there was already something. And the something was beneath the surface of the deep. So what's already there? That deep, that depth was already there. And so God merely understood it and made them come out of the deep. And first of all, there was light and darkness, and he saw, oh, light is good. Maybe darkness is not so good. I don't know if he actually said that. So let there be light, right? So so there was things in that deep that is incomprehensible that God, through his intellect, understanding, was able to penetrate and bring it out. So there was something. It was not out of nothing. And by the time you get to the early Christian Bible, It was in the beginning was you could either say the word or the logos. I think the word's it's a later manifestation, logos. Logos is a kind of rationality, a kind of logic, a kind of dialectical emergence. So therefore, in a sense, logic, in a sense, was sort of, in a way, displacing the deep, the unknown. This was really, I think this was a really deep debate between Socrates and Plato to begin with, right? Socrates says, I'm the wisest man because the oracle told me I was wise and I know I don't know anything. So it must simply be because I at least know that I don't know. Whereas everybody else thinks they know, and they know even less because they didn't even know they didn't know, right? And I think Plato sort of said, oh, yes, you do. The Athenians were wrong executing you, right? You know, you, and so Socrates actually, in a way, was used as a mouthpiece for him to tell his story about the forms. Because the forms were emerging, in a sense, it's not a hardwire structure in which there was no flexibility. It was always in the process of emerging. I think of it as like because the thing is, when you deal with a civilization and institutions, you have to have a structure, you know, or form. You could call that formalism or structuralism, because that's how mankind gives form to things, to relationships. The question is, do you want a hard form or do you want a flexible form? So I always thought of I always admired spiders because they created a structure that was flexible. It flexed in the wind, you know, and it's a structure that it could build a nest and survive in the world as it is. So in some sense, that is the idea of the web of the form that creates what we understand. And you could say that's the form of language that does not harden, but a language that's constantly evolving and sometimes has to be deconstructed to, in a sense, create the looseness for the creativity to enter the form. Otherwise, once you get a hardened lead, a hardened form, like a steel girder, there's not much room for new ideas. All you could do is, well, pile more concrete on it. That's all you got. It's like, so therefore, in a sense, you need something that on the one hand gives it form, give it structure, and yet it's flexible enough for creativity to take place. So in the beginning, God, in a sense, the creativity was there to pull out the things out of the deep and, in a sense, throw it into the world of things that has both the stuff, the content, and the forms. Okay, so that's logos. I mean, I think that was, in a sense, a step, and I think when the Christian church, and they very very much made him into a saint. I mean, Plato was a saint that was probably in many ways higher than the apostles because he spoke to the church. I talked to a theologian about that, and it was a kind of Neoplatonism in a way. So, but it's not Plato. That's why they made a mistake because it was not embodied in the human mind. It was embodied in some kind of mysticism
Yes.
in its own way. So, in some sense, they had, and that's because they didn't. I think it was until the Arabs that they got a truer Plato. I mean, because the writings was already translated and canonized in a sense by Plotinus, and then of course Augustine, who was a very, very important founding father of the Christian Church. So in some sense, I think if we went back to Plato, we would not have Platonism, but we will have Plato, which is a human mind thinking, the finite mind thinking and
Hmm.
progressing, but not like these are the forms. Plato's got all the answers. There you
Hmm.
go. And don't have to do anything except follow what Plato said. But he never explained what it was that he said. He just we have the structure that we have to deal with, a formal structure in relationship to at least building a civilization. I
Yes.
think that's the synthesis that we should listen to, not not Plotinus and Augustine. Although I love Augustine, but he really transformed into a transcendental religion rather than a emergent religion. Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. I
Thanks.
hope you enjoy that,
Thank
Donald,
you.
because you're a Plato scholar.
Thanks, Phil.
Well said.
Yes.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, there's a sense in which, we've talked before, William Blake's "As a Man is, so he sees." There's a sense in which, the projection. We've been so focused on how moderns project the modern worldview back onto medieval and ancient writers, and so we don't read what they meant. We read what we would have meant if we'd written those words, which is a completely different message. I think that's really what's happening with the medieval interpretations or misinterpretations of Plato and Aristotle, is that Plato and Aristotle are philosophers. They're trying to get people to think. They're saying, look at what's possible if you just look at the world with your mind alive and open to things.
But
But
by the way, you know what got me thinking about this was there is a discipline on formalism, meteorology, which is the relationship of parts to other parts to the whole. That's what form is.
yes,
The relationship of parts to other parts of the whole.
yeah,
And so therefore you know it's not the one have this sort of like what is these games, because it has a structure that allows for the relationships in a way, but you can only go so far before it breaks the thing and goes outside of the formal structure itself. So if you want to think of Plato, think of meteorology,
yeah.
Mereology.
I put it in the chat. Yeah, it's an incredibly important topic among the ancients. But of course, the medievals had their worldview, and their worldview was based on an orthodoxy.
Yeah.
We're trying to establish an orthodoxy. So when they read Plato, they assumed he was trying to establish an orthodoxy. And so they created this Platonism out of Plato by making an orthodoxy he never intended. And then this is what Aquinas does later when he picks up Aristotle and he says Aristotle has the correct answers to everything. And Aristotle himself would never have said that. Aristotle's trying to teach you how to think and how to look at the essentials and tell the difference between what's essential and what's inessential. He's trying to teach how to think. And these guys are coming back to him with their orthodoxy oriented minds and assuming he must have been an orthodoxy oriented person. And so they on the one hand, when they import an orthodox pseudo Plato into the medieval worldview, it's a step up, because even an overly orthodox misinterpretation of Plato is an improvement over the sloppy thinking that's going on at the time that they bring him in. And that's why later Aquinas does the same thing with Aristotle. He reads Aristotle and goes, my God, this is so much better than what I see around me and my fellow theologians. Let's import Aristotle. But of course he doesn't. He imports an orthodox form of pseudo Aristotle. But even so, it's a jump. It's an improvement in the quality.
Well, the thing is that if you accept Plato as such a foundational thing, and you accept that the Neoplatonists Plato,
Yeah,
Aristotle is going to have to fit into the formal structure
that's right.
of
That's right.
Neoplatonism,
That's
which
right.
and Aristotle was told, in his way, a reaction against Plato.
Yes,
So,
it's all
I mean,
lost
like,
when cram him
but
into
they
that.
really have to twist Aristotle even more.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean the Procrustean bed is alive and well as they pull in these people and warp them to fit them into the Orthodox theology. But it's because they can see that there are problems with their theology, but they can't see what the solution is. The solution must be some kind of orthodoxy. They can't see the orthodoxy as the problem. That's what's getting them in trouble. If they would get that, filter out from in front of their eyes, then they could draw real Platonism and real Aristotelianism into the medieval worldview and just blow it open in a great ferment of creativity. But they're incapable of doing that because it must be some kind. Everything's got to be an orthodoxy, right? That's the whole point of everything is the orthodoxy. And we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But first, Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, what I want to do primarily is go back to the paragraph because I think a lot of what we've been talking about is in the paragraph. And we want to go back to Stephen's very question at the beginning where he said the difference between deism and theism, because it's all here. And Christianity is, like most religions, are very controversial. And Christianity is represented by Paul, who never had the teachings of Jesus Christ. And I heard Zelig say some things which I would really like to address. But first, I want to read the paragraph, the whole paragraph, which is a kind of synopsis of the discussion we're having. May I do that? So it says, deism, however, conceives that the gods are remote, implacable, abstract, and faceless powers, no more moral or just in human terms than our forces of nature. It is a religion of alienation and futility, whether as determinism, fata, and I think we talked about this last week, or as a blind chance fortuna, a worldview more metaphysical than moral and more intellectual and desperate than pious and full of gratitude for the bounties of a rich existence. Deism, aloof and inhuman divine powers naturally decay over centuries into a deus absconditus who was abandoned man. And that's where I think the medievals and in the early adoption of Christianity started to have problems, right? With the core belief system. Who has abandoned man, his God is a free, inconsistent person, liable to reverse his decisions, to be softened in his judgments by prayer, to repent of his overactions, or a rigorous and unitary metaphysical principle, necessitarian and lawful. I think Kenneth Smith probably made up that word. Continuing, it took the scrupulous reasoning of Spinoza to unmask these incoherences of Christian theology. And I think one of our participants asked last week about Spinoza. I know nothing about him, but if he's unmasking the inconsistencies of the Christian theology, the schizophrenia of the moral, theist, and metaphysical deist dimensions in its notion of divinity that its ancient critics had also foreseen. For all of its centuries, Christianity attempted to derive the benefits of radically incommensurable theorizing postures of modes of religious worldviews. So what he's saying here is that Christianity is really a combination of the culture in which it existed. It took a little bit of this and a little bit of that,
Yes.
and made it made up its theology.
Yes.
And for me, the controversial thing is that Paul, who never ever sat at the feet of Jesus Christ, was the main propagator. And so Paul wrote letters to the Thessalonians, the Galatians, the Corinthians, all about how to set up a church and run it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And organize it. And that was the job of Paul. Now, I guess we can discuss all of this, but there's one thing that really stuck out in my mind that Zelig said about Jesus when Jesus was born. You know, if the death of Jesus was an evil thing. Jesus the Messiah actually, and Ari can comment on this, I'd like him to comment on this, was actually a Jewish concept. The Jews were awaiting the Messiah because the Messiah was going to return the Jews to prosperity.
Right.
When Jesus came, they just didn't believe him and they didn't accept it. Hence, Christianity got born. And it was predicted, and one of the authenticities of the Bible is the link between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The prophecies in the Old Testament that came through the New Testament, Jesus's birth, Jesus was supposed to die because this was redemptive and he was going to save us from our sins. However that sounds, that's how it is, right? And so it wasn't God being evil. And the question of evil in the world, I think, was answered finally in my mind by C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain.
Yes, I know it well.
That is a very difficult book, right? But it explores a lot of theological and theoretical concepts in an attempt to answer that question.
Yes.
Right? Evil is a necessary part of life. Because, when I kid myself, I said, if you don't understand pain, then how are you going to appreciate joy? That's a contrast. You have to appreciate that.
Yes.
And
that's what Heraclitus says.
Excuse me?
That's what Heraclitus says.
Yes. Yeah. And I guess C.S. Lewis talked about that in the and the faith, the question of faith, which is central to Christianity, which is the assurance of things hoped for and belief in things not seen, right? That's Paul. Paul, in his letter to the Hebrews, talked about this. And I want us, and I think I never get away from the fact that the establishment of the medieval religion or the medieval belief system was very, very, very political. Faith is a tool for control, political control. We even see it today. The television evangelists, they get on television and they're so rich is because they convince you to send them their money. You have faith in them. That's what that is. It still exists. So faith, while a religious concept, is a significant political concept. And you just said, the Pope said that if you weren't Christian, you couldn't own land. Domination again. Right? And it's all about political control. And the two go hand in hand because that's how they rule people. And that's why they built those magnificent edifices of worship. It provided room, board, and shelter. And it was always a way of control. That's it. But I like this whole paragraph because it summarizes what we were saying.
It does. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks for reading it.
Oh, and I wanted to mention one other thing about theism and deism, because I had a son and he went through this deism thing. And the book that we read, which I went to this room just now and got it. It's called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And he was an investigative journalist. Very, very, very good book, right? And it linked the Old Testament's prophecies with the New Testament occurrences. And it was investigative journalism, but it was, Lee Strobel was an atheist. And this was part of his establishment of his belief system. So was C.S. Lewis initially also. Okay, thank you. That's my take.
Thank you, Sharon. Look at all the hands. Look at you stimulating all this discussion. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I might say something that's a bit off topic, but it could be equally on topic. A friend of mine's doing some study, and of course, to study anything, you've got to do the politically correct, whatever it is, course to go with it. And she showed me this video, and the video, coming from the new knowledge, says everything that's wrong with our society was a set of choices. And use some all caps in that as well, of course. We invoke the power of all caps. It's a special D&D plus, when you're going through the dungeons fighting zombies. You hit that zombie with 100 power. You can just use the magic of all caps against them. But this sort of concept which floats around that it's sort of like man is God. Man can be all powerful, all knowing. It's humanism. This was something that was pointed out by Max Stirner, that when modern atheist humanism showed up in Feuerbach, he said, well, what you're doing actually is you're erasing God and putting man in place. And Max Stirner was very annoyed with this, and he said, hey, I was labouring under the oppression of the old God, and thanks for taking that away, but why are you trying to institute this new God to oppress me called human? I mean, I am human, but you're taking humanity away from me and setting it up as a God that I have to live up to. And Stirner was more or less, Stirner was saying, look, I'm free now. Thanks for it, but I'm going to remain free. And of course, Marx, reading everything that Stirner wrote, had a head explosion that blew his mind apart. Yeah, you reckon the system, Stirner, we want to get rid of the old oppression so we can put in place the new oppression. Now, what's dangerous about this concept, it's like this famous case, the Zaria Chamberlain case, where the dingo supposedly made off with the baby. Okay, the baby disappeared. Dingoes were seen in the vicinity. Trackers came out. They said it was a dingo. But society couldn't accept it. It went for years and years and years. They just couldn't accept the concept that a wild animal could attack and eat a baby, drag it off. Now, if you went back to the glorious days of the American Wild West, obviously a good Christian mother is going to tell her good Christian children, I know that bear looks like a fluffy animal, but keep away from it. But we started living in a society which was divorced from this reality, which was relatively safe, which was controlled, and that control is now being conceived as being absolute. I mean, was everything that ever went bad in history a result of a committee meeting? We've decided to push that button. It's not like we didn't realise that there was a problem. We knew there was going to be a problem. We deliberately created that as a choice. I mean, this sort of stuff in the old days would have, had the Inquisition going, I reckon. But this is the sort of stuff that's being thrown around there. And they're claiming, you must obey us. You cannot say no to our speculations. You can't even debate our speculations. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Zella, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. But you gotta find your mute button. Oop, no joy. He may have stepped away.
No, it got kind of frozen on my screen. Yeah, well, I think in what Stephen was saying about modern man knowing everything, I think the problem with modern man is that he thinks he could know everything. And I think in the 1950s and 60s in academia there was a big rise in the study of epistemology. How do you know what you know? And the conclusion of decades upon decades, up in the even in the early 2000s, of how do we know what we know? The best that we can do was that our knowledge at best is probabilistic, and our epistemology, even in our best methods, you might be right once. Maybe you can predict things 1 out of 100, but not all the time. And I think modern man has come down to the conclusion in a very modern civilized way, that the ancients knew that we cannot know everything because nature is unfathomable. But in discarding the ancient wisdom is that even though we cannot know everything, even from the epistemological perspective that we stand, God could reach out to us. The infinite could reach out to us and touch us. Even though we can't reach out to the infinite could reach out to us. And studies in calculus have led us to actually believe that that's a possibility. For example, asymptotes. When we study asymptotes, we understand that it's a line on a graph that always approaches zero, but we can't perceive it. However, at a point in infinity, it comes back to zero. And so and then we realize that we can actually divide infinities as well and do things with infinities. And that is what has led the modern revolution of what iPhones do what they do, because of the nature of how the way that we deal with infinities and all these functions that we do with it. And so I think that what modern man misses is the realization that the infinite could touch us, even though we can't touch the infinite. And that is what the ancients would call revelational epistemology.
Right.
That even though I can't not know, God does, and he could reveal it to me. He can reveal to me infinity to me if that is what pleases him, because he could have that upon his will. And then to respond to Sharon, I heard Sharon say that the Apostle Paul was a tax accountant and didn't actually see Jesus. Well, that's inaccurate. If we go to the New Testament, we see that on the road to Damascus, Paul had a physical revelation where Jesus appears to him in a great light and literally blinds him. And then the Greek says, in the Koine Greek, it says that Paul heard him in Aramaic. And in Aramaic, asked him, "Why do you persecute me, Paul?" And he's all like, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "Why do you persecute me?" And that's when he realized that he was persecuted, that Jesus was saying, "You're persecuting my brothers, you're persecuting me." And he's literally blinded, and he's sent to the house of Cornelius to be preyed upon because he had these scales on his eyes that couldn't let him see. And then he gets preyed on, and these scales fall off. And then throughout the letters that he writes, he reports about how he didn't receive the gospel through one of the apostles, the other apostles, but he literally received the gospel message by Jesus himself. And so Paul tells us that he literally saw Jesus in flesh and blood after the resurrection and was one of the last ones to have seen him. Now, the reason that you probably hear that Paul never saw Jesus is probably because liberal scholars don't believe that such things as apparitions of resurrected beings, it can actually happen. And I think that's it gets us to another topic, right? Of scholarly how do modern scholars interpret scriptures? Do you have liberal scholarship that says any supernatural reference, well, that can't be accurate, that's inauthentic and ahistorical, and only things that have no supernatural elements in it is historical and accurate? Well, then that we go back to the idea of, well, do you believe the revelational epistemology is possible? Do you believe that God exists or doesn't exist? Do you believe that immaterial entities could exist or not? And we go back to hermeneutics and back to the method of, fundamentally we have to answer the question: do you believe in God in modernity or not? Do you believe that in this world there's another dimension where there's entities living and having an impact in the material world like the ancients did? Or are you going to be like the in today's world where if we can't see it or touch it, it doesn't exist? We can measure it, it doesn't exist. And so I think that's what kind of fuels the debate and discussion as to whether Paul was completely foreign and alien to Christianity, because it's right there in the Bible that Paul says that he literally saw Jesus, and Jesus literally sent him to preach the gospel after he was resurrected. So that would be my response to Sharon. And
And Zelig, let me just interrupt here.
sure, go for it.
Seeing Jesus
Yes.
and being with him every day, like the 12 disciples were, are two different things.
No, Paul says that he was with
Let me
Jesus.
finish. He was with him, but he didn't sit at Jesus's feet.
No, he
And
did.
was
He said
the
he
way-
literally was sent by Jesus. It
Yes.
You're
tells
talking
you in
about two
the
different things. You're talking about two
Yes.
different things.
You're talking about two different things. He saw Jesus in an apparition. It's like we had, like the way on the Acts of Apostles, when the three people ascended to heaven. It's that kind of apparition, right?
no, that's not what I
But-
mean. No, that's not what I
Hold
mean.
on, he saw Jesus, but he did not sit at Jesus's feet and get the teachings.
No,
And
that's
one of the paradoxes of Christianity.
No, that's the text. That's the reason that I sent you that text. He actually says that he learned it from Jesus, not from the
He
apostles.
saw him. He saw him.
No. It says in the text that he learned from Jesus and was
This
sent
is-
as an apostle.
I'm
That's
gonna-
what
I'm gonna- I'm
that's
going to
what the
step in at
Greek
this
word.
point, Zelig. I'm going to step in. What we have here is what I call a violent agreement.
A heartily agreement.
You mean the same thing, but you're using different words to say it, and now you're arguing over whether you use the same words to say it. But you don't have to use the same words because you have the same assessment, and the same assessment is, yeah, he saw Jesus. He didn't see Jesus during Jesus's lifetime, during his ministry prior to the crucifixion, but he did see him after that. So, each of you are trying to say that same thing, but you're just using different words to say it.
To add to that, Rick, you're right in the sense that he wasn't a believer when Jesus was alive, but he converted after the resurrection and was taught after the resurrection.
Yeah.
To send the message. That's
You
what I
and
mean.
Sharon agree. You and
Yeah,
Sharon.
we're
That's
agreeing.
what
We
I'm
agree.
saying. That's what I'm saying, Zelig. That's what I'm saying. That Paul's teachings or Paul's association with Christianity came after Jesus was gone, after Jesus had completed his ministry. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. This term violent agreement, I used to serve on a programming language committee for many years. I eventually became vice chair, and it's one of the things we noticed. We'd be debating the future of the language, and two very intelligent people with good hearts would be up there arguing vociferously against each other. The rest of us are scratching our heads going, what is this argument even about? We try to break it down and we realize they both 100% agree with each other. They just didn't use the same words to say it, and now they're having an argument about what's the right way to say the thing. And so we learned to coin this term, violent agreement. It means, you know what? Let the words go. You guys are already in agreement. You're cool. So this is the interesting position with Paul. Yeah, and I think you guys agree about that. So thank you both. And I'm going to call on Ari and then Phil, and then I'm going to take us to paragraph 9 because I think we could get through paragraph 9 today because I'm just an optimist that way. But Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you got to find your mute button, Ari. Unless you
Sorry, guys. Yeah. No, I pressed the wrong button. I'll say I had on, so I'm gonna take that off. So, back inside. Yeah, roboting exactly. Okay, so where are we? I don't want to talk about the text direct, but I really want to bring up the idea of theism and deism in something we've discussed before, which is, again, traditionally the Hebrew or Jewish tradition of seeing God as both a monotheist, and I think the new word here is a polydeist. I almost feel like the word polytheism is not a real word, because to be a polytheist, you actually should be a polydeist, because these forces of nature have an objective or impersonal sort of status. Like I don't have a relationship with the sea or or the ocean, but it's definitely really right there, and there's no denying the ocean exists. And I want to take this to an idea of that actually gets to neuroscience and this idea of how we construct ourselves, this idea of having um, a sense of the external reality around us, which we would have to be a fool to believe that reality doesn't exist and that we're just creating it from inside of ourselves. And so therefore there is some sort of objective reality out there, and that there are objects that we create as fixed things, like trees, or even the idea of a tree is theoretically semi-fixed, even though that's still a construction of a non-essential form. But in the moment when we use it, it takes an essential form, which is a different thing to not get into too much. But the basic idea is this idea of an objective reality and a personal reality, and that the Bible, in the very beginning, just from the beginning of both the creation story, that when God created the world in 7 days, that's a description of a universal reality, which would be called the God of nature. And then the next part is about how the Garden of Eden, and to fast forward to how the actual Jewish people practice their observance of the Sabbath, is always this idea of we bless the Sabbath with this prayers over like grape juice or wine. And the way it goes, it's a twofold blessing. It starts with we there's this idea of the Sabbath too, is a two-component thing, is that we should remember it and protect it. And this takes us to the idea of what I'm getting to, is how identity is formed through this idea of making an external or an identity based on an external threat, like simply back in the day when we were tribes and there might have been animals that were predators to us. We had to create, goes to Phil's idea of structure and form. We would have to create a rigid structure of a self that is in specifically relating to that which is outside of us, that we need to protect ourselves. And there's a word for this in the Jewish Bible, in the Parsha of Bamidbar. Also, I looked it up in the Christian version, would be Numbers 8.1 through 12.16. You have this idea of the Jewish people that are in the desert, and they're either a camp or they're a congregation. And the Hebrew, specifically, if people want the words, this might be for more people like Zelig, it's a mahana or a mahanot, which means like a camp, which you're facing outward to protect yourself against an external threat. And this is where you create a more rigid form. And your identity is based not on who you are, but what you're not. For instance, it's easier to conceive of a cat rather than describing all the details of what a cat is. You can say a cat is not a dog. A cat is not a bird. A cat is not a tree, right? Because we know what those things are, we can get very close to the idea of what a cat is by what it's not. And this is by defining something by its external nature. And that has a rigid form that is essentially a fingerprint. But then another form of identity is based on your internal sense of self, which is what in English we'd call a congregation, or in Hebrew it's an eda, which means a witness. And in this case, internal construction of things is purely relational, and the external construction of things is purely objective. And this takes this idea that when you're in an emergency and you don't have the luxury of relationships, you create objective relationships or object-subject relationships in order to make good predictions, and you unify this based on what's externally around you. And this makes a lot of sense for motivation for what's going on with the medieval period of this theist problem, is that when the early part of the Christian empire or Christian religion is taking hold in empire through the church, it's much more of an internal sense of relationship and a congregation where it's internally defined based on values and practices. But later on, when you're in an emergent threat of emergencies where you're fighting either, some things we don't talk about, but I was thinking the classic version of the Christian mythology in the medieval period is their fear of being destroyed by the Islamic Empire through the Crusades. And they're unifying in this sense as a camp as towards an external threat. And this is where you specifically see the rise of anti-Semitism and removing of great Jewish centers, specifically placed in Worms, that had an amazing center of Judaism, where a famous scholar named Rashi comes from, and he only survives because he's in France. But he talks about himself, as we nowadays in modern Jewish learning use Rashi to basically understand all of the Talmud. Without him, we don't have any understanding of what's going on. He is the number one guy. And he describes himself as like the little toe of what was going on in Worms at that time before it was destroyed. And so, again, what's going on here is this Christian empire is forming itself as a camp against something external, making it very objectified and to some degree very about bureaucratic precepts that you just need to obey. And this makes sense when you're in a war or you're a battle or you're against an external threat like a predator, right? And this is when identity is more like a camp where you're externally motivated. And you see that this is also the rigidity of almost like an older person versus the plasticity of a young baby. A young baby is much more of the internal world that's being constructed and doesn't have very robust sense of structure or self yet. That's literally what a baby is. It doesn't able to react against this world. But you look at an older person, they're the exact opposite. In their old age, they're unable to adapt to the world around them. And they're very much locked into a structure. And so you see, I'm almost thinking that there's a very important relationship between like deism versus theism as a function of how one needs to interact with their reality. And what's going on in this medieval era is things are changing from a younger empire to an older empire, and where they're kind of locked into the growth cycle of organisms growing or being born and then growing and then decaying, and that one, when one is perceiving a sense of threat, that one is locked into this identity of what's outside of me. And this gets to the idea back into whether you have a theistic God or a deistic God. In a deistic God, which the gods, so to speak, of the ancient Terra, specifically the Greeks, had this idea of the fates, and a Stoic person just accepts the reality around them. But we are in a sort of a tragedy that we cannot change our fate. That is a deistic position. But in a relationship where you have, that's also what I wish Joe was here. This relates to a world or an identity based on contingency. There's an external threat, and my contingency is to deal with this as a reaction against this external threat, much more based on contingency. But when you have a more of a safe position, let's say a loved baby or a child in a nurturing environment, the relationships form, and now you have a much greater sense of agency. And so you see the theistic God takes its place when people need agency in their lives, even if it's a mythology that's not really real. It's just people want or need or reject sort of this contingency that there's thrust upon them. And the opposite is true when we're in an emergency and there's a predator like the Islamic nation or maybe the Jewish people, that they're the evil devil, whatever you want to call it. There's some sort of external threat. Then you go to a deistic God where you want more contingency. You want to be more focused on the external reality that's unified. And so there's this relationship between a deism being this force of nature and a theism where there's a God of relations. There's also a specific thing that we don't really talk about here much that I don't know if it follows in the Christian canon or the Christian world, that God has pretty much two names that each reflect this type of relationship. In the God of creation of the world, that you have a God that's called Elohim or Elohim. That basically means a force of nature, but really it's a plural word that's a forces of nature in a single package. And that's impersonal and it's universal. And the opposite is the tetragrammaton of we just say Hashem for the name that we're not supposed to say because it's sacred, is this idea of the God of relations and a God of agency versus a God of pure fate. And so to me it resembles that when Christianity or Judaism to some degree, any identity or culture needs to bank on more of a unified sense of self to protect ourselves against the external. That means we make the threats external and we make our focus on the external and unifying against the external. And then when we're in a theistic relational and we're building senses of selves, now we're talking about relationships which are fluid and flexible and predicated on a sense of safety versus a sense of emergency.
That's really interesting, Ari. Thank you for that. That was fantastic. And so now I'm never going to see, remember and protect the Sabbath without thinking of this conversation. The remember being the more inward facing, internal alive, and the protect being the outward facing, more rigid.
Oh, no, I gotta stop you right there. That's actually a really weird thing that I was studying, that when we actually use the language, when we say protect, we talk about the God of relationships.
Ah,
About remember, we talk about the God of relationships. It's so weird how these things intertwine with each other in a weird way. And then
yes,
we see this ever if you're looking at the Sabbath, these things, the nature of when you have the God of history, which is the personal God, is that's the God who took you out of Egypt. And when
right,
you have the God of nature, that's the God who made heaven and earth in 7 days. And it's
right.
really weird that, and I don't really understand this paradox, is that when we say this word protect, we talk about the God that took you out of Egypt, which is the relational God. And then
Yeah,
when we talk about the God of remember or to connect, that's when you talk about the God of creation. So it's like a
wow.
weird, and the last
Inverted.
part thing that's weird is this is the relational God is the hidden God or the female aspect of God, which is the hidden in the we've never talked this so much in this place, but I feel like it's important for understanding mythology is the female and male dynamics of things that's kind of got messed up in modern times. But
Yeah,
the philosophical or historical is just simply that female is hidden and male is revealed. And and maybe you guys were talking about this, how God used to be reveal himself through prophets, and that stopped. That was basically God revealing himself, having a sort of a male relationship. But when God turns to be hidden, this is God being feminine in nature. And so Judaism, at least just the Judeo mythology around this, is entirely there's male female dynamics all over the place, and that every concept has both male and a female aspect. Everything has some sort of hidden component, and everything has some sort of revealed component. And so it just gets messy and confusing. But these are also interesting dynamics about like what's at play,
yeah,
during the later part when the Christian empires wanted to be more powerful and dogmatic. That would be certain sort of exerting some sort of sense of objective reality in a more male dynamic, what's revealed. But then there's all these hidden things going behind to balance that. So I don't know if that's important or interesting to others, but I find that these ways of conceptualizing can offer dynamics that
yeah,
reveal motivations almost.
yeah. That was very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna be soaking in that for a while. Thanks, man. That's very useful. Uh, it's gonna take a while to fully process and integrate that. Phil, come off mute and share what's on your mind.
Yeah, I think what I got to say is somewhat related to what Ari said, but in a different way. I think of the inner and the outer is kind of interesting because I think there's three levels. I mean, and the one is within myself, my being, my ideas, and so forth. And the outer is actually a relationship between myself and other human beings. I mean, I am a diehard humanist. And then there's the that outer world, which is nature and the cosmos. And that's a different relationship. You know, I it, when I began painting seriously, I was pretty much a modernist. Still am a modernist. But I had a radical change and that surprised many people because they thought I was a better artist back when I was doing what I call the anti-painting period. And but I switched to and I've been painting ever since, paintings of fallen angels. And that has to do with my idea about being human in many ways. But as in the being human in the sense that we are in a sense, two species. We're mankind, and we are fallen angels, which is human. We understand that we have a shortcoming. We haven't arrived at a true understanding of who we can be. And if you're just a mankind, part of mankind, and I accept that for every what we call normal human beings, as something that does not even realize that part. And so the fallen angels, they all have they all kind of resemble human beings, uh, but they have wings, which means they do want to fly. And but they but they don't fly. They're grounded. That's what we are. And then but at least you recognize you want to fly. You know, you want to go further. Uh, I don't know whether the transcendence. The other thing I look at is, is like I was very curious. I would call myself a soft atheist because I reason because when I first did that, I thought it was a relationship, not only art, but art in relationship to philosophy. And I thought religion. I later on changed that idea because I realized I was not all that religious, but I certainly believe in the human spirit. I mean, so that stands in for a kind of religion, the human spirit itself, the spiritual part. So I'm a spiritual humanist, you could call it that way. And the thing about nature is that there was an interesting discussion about the double slit experiment between Einstein and Niels Bohr. Of course, Niels Bohr believed in the double slit experiment as sort of like in quantum mechanics, and Einstein doesn't. And Einstein essentially said, well, God does not play dice with the universe. A very profound statement, He believes in an absolute truth of sort. And I think Niels Bohr was more of a humanist. He believes in the human limitations. And what the double slit experiment shows is something very odd because when you take a single electron, uh, it lands in a certain spot. But when you take a whole bunch of electrons, they form a wave. So the wave and the particle, they seem to coexist in some form. And that might be the problem between the finite and the infinite. So the most you could make of that is that somehow we are caught in the period of probabilities, which sounds very much like a kind of chaos until you see the probabilities uh, form together. But the probabilities are absolutely not exact. It's not an absolute line that you could say you could depend on. It's only an approximation. So therefore, in a sense, all you could do, closest you could do with human intellects, at least unless they invent something even newer, is to have a statistical probability. How do you live in that thing that is semi-chaotic? And I looked up this thing myself very much. What you have to do is create a structure, a human relationship that, in a sense, relies on uh, harmony. And that's the thing about music that does that. Harmony, in a sense, create a synthesis that is very real. And I want to bring out Plato. Plato is a very big hero of mine. And he said this, I make sure I want to quote it directly. He said, music is the one incorporeal entrance into the higher world of knowledge, which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend. In other words, the statistical probabilities understands our problem. We can't understand it, but it understands us. And all we could do is come to some harmony. And Niels Bohr did say something very, very strange. He says, science has finally come to a point where it is very much like poetry. In
Yes.
other words, we try so hard to create an absolute language that describes, you know, God does not play with dice. Okay. All right. That didn't work. And so all we have is, in a sense, poetic language, which we had negated because
Yes.
it has enough ambiguity to contain that allows human beings to, in a sense, acknowledge some kind of synthesis that's based on harmony in relationship with others, in relationship that the community itself could, in a sense, sing in a choir, and in a sense, get an approximation of what reality is. Was a singularity, myself, just myself, and isolated in a cave, I would, well, I would be one electron that's in a certain spot
Yes.
without, in a sense, understanding that. And so I think the fact that, you know, that split between poesis and logos becomes an important decisive point. To what point does logos tell you a direction to the forms? To what degree that it only hints at a direction to the point, pointing to the direction of the forms? And that the curiosity is Plato talked about the forms, but he didn't write a thesis. He wrote it in poetic form. He, po
Yes.
he wrote it as a play. You know, like that seems like a
Yeah.
paradox. You know,
Yes.
write a treatise for heaven's sakes, and put at the end, therefore, dot dot dot, the forms are.
Yes.
You know,
But no, he gives us a dialogue.
so so therefore, in a sense, he was equivocating because like he wants to point you in the direction, but he never really said what it was. He just hinted in a
Yeah.
kind of approximate poetic direction. So I think that paradox comes through when you read his thing, and you realize that, oh, that's the ambiguity. The form he wrote it in is not the form that he's talking about. So
Yes.
so he retains some of that relationship by, in a sense, purposely doing that, in a sense. So I think we might do well to at least not reject poetry totally, that in some sense it does reveal approximation of what it might be in a world that's beyond our understanding. So therefore, it seemed like chaos. And all we have is a double slit that tells us. And I think we believe in, which is a much more complex explanation because it actually has to do with chaos theory. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. I know we've got hands, but we're down to the last half hour, and I want to give Kenneth Smith a chance to talk. So I want to take us back to the text for paragraph 9, which I'm going to drop into the text. It's going to take 3 parts because it's a longer paragraph. So there's where it begins, and then there's the middle, and then finally here's the end. And it's because I think paragraph 9 really pulls together one of the important themes we've been talking about last week and this week. So I don't want to lose the chance for that integration. And what I'm reading here, he's in the same way that I'm uncomfortable with the term Judeo-Christian because I think that the Jewish theology and the medieval theology are very different from each other and shouldn't be blurred together. I also think Greco-Roman is a problem. And that's my setup for this paragraph, because for the Romans, it was a matter of imperial policy to pretend to be Greeks. They're like, we've conquered the Greeks, and now the way that we're going to keep the Greeks in the empire is say, hey, we're all Greco-Romans together. We're not 2 different peoples at war with each other. We're one shared culture. How can you fight against yourself? We're you. They were, in doing that, they were imitating what Alexander the Great had already done when he conquered the Greeks. He said, I'm not a Macedonian, I'm a Greek. We're all Greeks together. And since we're all Greeks together, we can conquer the world. And the Greeks loved this idea. And so the Romans were just copying, and they were deliberately, and they say it repeatedly, they're just copying what the Macedonians did to the Greeks when they coined the idea of the Greco-Roman. Now, if you look closely at Jupiter versus Zeus, or Athena versus Minerva, or Dionysus, versus Bacchus, the way that we're taught it as moderns is they're the same gods. They're just 2 different names for the same god. But if you actually look at the distinctively Roman myths versus the distinctively Greek ones, you see that some of these deities are pretty close to each other, but others are very different. I mean, Bacchus and Dionysus are spectacularly different. Bacchus is the god of getting drunk. Dionysus is the god of gnosis. It includes getting drunk, sure, but this is also the patron of theater as an agon in which pressures can be applied to characters to reveal who the characters truly are, to illustrate the invisible, to make the invisible visible. Now, this is stuff that Bacchus doesn't much have. The Roman Bacchus has very little of that, but the Greek Dionysus has an enormous amount of that. And you see similar differences as you look. So this idea that the Greeks and the Romans are different, it's running throughout chapters 4 and 5 in Kenneth Smith's writing here. He's saying that the Greeks are illustrating the classical ancient culture and worldview, but the Romans are showing it in a corrupt form, a rotten form. It's late stage ancient. And so we're not seeing, as Aristotle would say, the essence of the ancient worldview. If the medievals are pushing back against the ancient worldview, they're not pushing back against the ancient Greek worldview because they don't know it. They're pushing back against the corrupt form that they see in Rome. That's what Augustine is writing about in City of God. He doesn't know the Athenian or Corinthian polis. He only knows Rome, which is a pale imitation from Kenneth's perspective. So I'm going to take us through this paragraph, and then I'll call on the hands that are up. I just want to make sure we get this chance to see, because I think that there's a key point here that helps to explain why the medieval religious empire is so different from the teachings of Jesus. He starts, the Romans, both plebes or commoners and patricians or wealthy nobility, conceived that the will of Jove or Jupiter put an ultimate seal on their fated lot. The powerful and moneyed classes were bound to act according to their class interests, and the deprived and destitute many were bound to suffer according to theirs. What was true among gods and animals, the privileges of hierarchic rank, was no less true among humans. What is permitted to Jove is not permitted to a cow. Quod licet Jovi non licet bovi. I could finally pronounce that more or less correctly. Religion, rather than tempering inhuman vices, merely ratified the course of an imperial juggernaut. I'm going to pause here, because what he's talking about, he's not saying ancient religion as it was meant to be. He's saying the corrupted form of ancient religion as we find it in Rome by the time of the empire. The form that the medieval revolutionaries are pushing back against. It's just ratifying what the emperor wanted to do anyway. Instead of being a sacred thing that is capable of pushing back again, even against the greatest temporal power when it overreaches into the sacred space that it doesn't belong in. Instead, it's been co-opted. It's become a tool of empire. As many of the Romans themselves wrote, the rule that Rome extended throughout the ancient world was unstintingly crass, a bleak and crushing extortionary power politics, rooted already in the very founding of Rome by a legendary gang of brigands. Indeed, Polybius's or Suetonius's history of regimes in Rome reads more like the chronicles of the mafia than the civilized rule of law. Not by virtue, but by brute force, Rome triumphed over the autonomous Greek polis and their codes of communal values, to give the very concept of politics a radically more materialist and brutal or coercive meaning. It is the cynical Roman worldview of realpolitik that dominates modernity, which finds the Greeks' politics as alien as their philosophy and culture. And then the final part of paragraph 3, and then I'll go to the questions. Politics to the Romans was the Machiavellian craft of domination through deception and the ruin of opponents, i.e., machinations of coercion and exploitation. The Greeks descended into this kind of feral power-mongering only with the decadent era of the sophists. But to the Romans, such predation and self-interest had been normal and universal from their very origins. In Hobbes's classic phrase, homo lupus hominis, man a wolf to man, political power-mongering thus eroded the very sense of community or friendship, socius societas, on which society was primally based. So I think the core argument that he's by spending this paragraph, and by the way, note that he didn't spend hardly any time on Rome in chapter 4, which is ostensibly about the ancient worldview. He's talking about it here in chapter 5, which is introducing the medieval worldview, because he's saying this corrupt stage of the ancient worldview is critical to the foundations of the medieval worldview. And you can see why, if you think about how did the concept of the Greco-Roman that the Romans introduced obscure the actual ancient ethos of the Greeks. And then you think about how did the supposedly Judeo-Christian worldview of the medieval orthodoxy obscure the genuine theology and culture of the Jews under anti-Semitism, sure, but also under papering over their theology and trying to replace it with a new one while pretending it's a continuation. And now imagine, take these two compromises and marry them together. What if an orthodoxy that had papered over Jewish theology and replaced it with a patched together theology then set out to become a religious empire by picking up the reins of the Roman Empire, which is a corrupt, rotten form of the ancient worldview? What kind of political economy is possible? What would it do to your theology to have that as your political economy? And you have to protect that political economy or your power doesn't grow. But if you do protect it and invest in it, what does that do to your value system and your ethos? And effectively, the question of why the early medieval Orthodox theology is so radically different from the theology of Jesus is easy to explain if you say, start by rejecting the Jewish parts of Jesus' message and then try to use the Roman Empire as the vehicle for Jesus' message. It's two massive compromises. By the time you're done with it, you have a whole new creature. I mean, this theology is not the theology of Jesus or of the Jews. It can't be. Another way to put it is that you have to have a form to matter. So if you imagine what sort of political economy would Jesus have started, you certainly don't imagine the religious empire of the medieval epoch. If you ask yourself, what sort of political economy would the Jews have started if the Romans hadn't, crushed the temple in Jerusalem, if they'd left them alone? What sort of political economy would the Jews have done that would be authentic to their religion and their culture? Well, it wouldn't have looked like the Roman Empire, right? So in order to look like the Roman Empire, the theology had to change tremendously. And so it did. And that's how you get the start into the medieval epoch, right? Old wine into new wines, new wine into old wineskins, indeed. It is a huge transformation. Before Sharon talked about the way that in reality putting the new wine into the old wineskins causes the old wineskins to burst. But if the old wineskin is stronger than the new wine, then what happens is you pour the new wine into the old wineskin and it ceases to be the new wine. It gets transformed by the old wineskin to become the image of the old wineskin, compatible with the old wineskin. And thus you get this massive transformation. So I think this is what he has in mind by putting this paragraph 9 here, is he's trying to talk about what kind of foundation is that for the kind of culture that for Jesus's message. Is this the vehicle Jesus would have chosen? And, very few people would say, yeah. This is exactly what he had in mind. Like, I don't think so. I think not. Most people would say not. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was looking at going back to paragraph 8. Where we were, God, so many here, I've lost it. Paragraph 8, when he talks about, okay, right, so Okay. Is God a free, inconsistent person liable to reverse his decisions to be, I've got a good bit here, to be softened in his judgments by prayer? Okay, guys, you can all pray and get God to repent of his overreactions. That sounds pretty good to me. That's why I pasted the Noah's Ark, the mini series. There's a point where God's decided, not as in the Bible, is, the ark's there and he's figured, oh, I've been thinking about it. I think it's a bit of a waste of time. I'll just do a clean sweep, wipe yours all out, and start over again. Things went wrong from the Garden of Eden. Just, clean clean everything. Just start over again. And Noah sort of, feels very bad that he's about to be wiped out, but he convinces God to give him a last chance. And then later in the movie, God says, well, even though I'm all powerful occasionally and all knowing, occasionally I'm wrong. So, this is a question. You can intervene with the all powerful, the almighty. Well, he pointed out to Noah, it's a bit difficult, being God. That I have nobody I can debate my decisions on on an equal level. But no, I thought I'd come down and just run it all past you, see what you think. There you go on, Sharon.
I just like to make a comment. God says in the Old Testament, he says, call unto me and I will answer you. That's the promise he made to the Jews. I can't come up with a big biblical reference right now, but he does say that. And he also says, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And if you seek me with all your heart, I will bless you. That's the Old Testament.
Yes. Very theistic and not deistic at all. Right?
Exactly.
Very personal.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. Of course, now we're going in the paragraph 9. We're talking about we're talking about the growth of the imperial tendency. The latest version of modern keeps on talking about colonization, but the original word that was thrown around was imperialism. And this is one of you're dividing the Romans from the Greeks. Now, the Greeks' empires crashed in very short order, relatively speaking, compared to Rome. Rome had somehow developed a sense of permanency that you just don't find. I mean, it's still outstanding today, just how long Rome lasted.
Yeah.
Most empires crash within 300 years. You've had a pretty good run, but Rome went a lot longer. So that's a big question. What did Rome have that your other more run-of-the-mill empires didn't have? We know Rome wasn't built in a day. The whole apparatus that was the Roman people and the Senate was a product of a few centuries of work before anybody bothered to notice they existed. Then they emerge. They're nominally a republic. They defeat the Carthaginians and they become an empire that's still essentially a democracy. So they're an imperialistic democracy. And an imperialistic democracy has two choices. If it wants to continue being imperial, you have to get rid of the democracy, which is what the Romans chose.
Right.
You take something like the British Empire, it crashed in short order because the centre of it was still a democracy, even though it was imperialistic in all its colonies.
Right.
So the colonies could say back to head office, well, you're a democracy, which is what the American colonists had also pointed out. What about us? And the British, oh, yeah, you have a right to be a democracy. And there goes the British Empire. An
Right.
empire cannot survive democracy for long.
And vice versa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and also, speaking from Australia, you know what you're talking about, right? I mean, Australia had this question about its relationship with Great Britain and the British Empire. You've wrestled with these questions more recently than Americans have, and as a result, I'm not surprised that you're the one to bring this up about the struggle between democracy and empire. It's astute. Thanks for sharing that. Zelig, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Reading the beginning of the paragraph 9 where it says that the Romans conceived that the will of Jove or Jupiter put an ultimate seal on their fate a lot. It makes me think a lot that when you're saying each successive epoch kind of takes and kind of morphs it into their own image, and there's a little bit of residue of what was left behind, it reminds me of today in modernity, where we've been able to plot the markets, which is basically what we mainly are, a consumerist society. And the patterns that have come out are like the ones that I posted on the timeline, and it's a head and shoulders pattern that appears since markets have been able to be followed and plotted, where the way the way people consume, buy and sell, trade in the markets have these pervasive patterns that they've been actually identified as a head and shoulders. And every time you see that pattern, you're like, oh, look, they're about to consume, they're about to buy or trade or sell or trade. And in modernity, that those are our Jupiters, those are our Jobs telling us this is what you fundamentally are, and this is how fundamentally are led by the fates, right? What is it that creates this pattern? It's something that it's innate in us, and it's something very human. And we basically conceive our politics, our religion today to get behind that consumerism, where our political decisions are how will the market react? Our religion, right? The prosperity gospel, it's to give me more blessings so I can buy more things in the markets. And so it is to reinforce these patterns like head and shoulders that the modern economists say is who we are, that we create these patterns in society, and some even take like a mystical view. I think his name was something Gann. He created an indicator, and he's like, yeah, these patterns are like mystical and independent. They're like kind of Platonic ideals that are independent of human behavior, and they kind of just drive the markets. And it's like, yeah, those are our modern Platos. Those are our modern religions. Our politics basically reinforce these supra sensible entities that we hold to be permanent. And we can see, and when I look at it, that the whole Roman society believed that politics was used to deceive. That's exactly what we believe politics is today, where we know that when the politician's speaking, he's lying. Like we take that for granted, like we don't even think he's telling the truth. We know he's selling us a bill of goods that it's not gonna fully deliver. So we're just basically reiterating of what the Romans did as well. I find that fascinating.
Thank you, Zelig. Yeah, it is remarkable. And part of what's astonishing is that, our founding fathers did it on purpose, right? They modeled the United States government and constitutions explicitly on Rome. They looked at Rome and they didn't go, oh my God, look at the corruption. They looked at Rome and said, wow, it lasted a long time. Let's make ourselves like Rome so we can last a long time. And of course, built into that is the absolute failure to see Tacitus saying what a massive hypocrisy and corruption it was. What horrible damage the Romans did to the world. The Pax Romana that Tacitus criticizes. It's not like Madison and Jefferson and the rest hadn't read Tacitus. They knew his criticisms, but still, that was the model we decided to follow. So we sort of have that problem with hypocrisy right out of the gate, in a way that the Greeks didn't. The Greeks had their period where they were trying their best to be candid and authentic with each other. I think the reason that he ends this paragraph the way he does, talking about the obsession with political power mongering, erodes the people's understanding that the reason that they exist is to create a societas. That's the point. The point is friendship, and that to the extent to which the political economy supports that friendship, it's a good, healthy political economy, as soprasune. But to the extent that it corrupts or erodes that societas, it lacks soprasune. It's what we shouldn't be doing. This is that distinction that is so easy to talk about in Greek and almost impossible in English. We just don't have the words for it. But I mean, I see this and I think of how often does Kenneth Smith give me back that quote over and over about Aristotle noting that above the agora, where the traders are all trying to get the best deal on each other, there's the statues of the charities to remind everybody that the point of trade, the reason we have trade, its only justification for existence is societas. It's because as a tool to aid soprasune, trade is a blessing. But if it's allowed to become an eroder of soprasune, then it's a curse and we shouldn't have it. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I guess what's in my mind is that why is it all civilization start out somewhat in an optimistic way, but it always decays into sort of some kind of bad thing, where greed is good. you know, uh, uh, you know, it reminds me so much of what you just said over there about the Romans transforming the Greek ideals into this sort of like uh, state power. It sounded very much like the Vedic religions in a way, because it almost seemed like it fragmented and became much more about the caste system. It seems like the Romans had their own caste system. And I was, I studied to some degree. I thought I should study the Upanishads. And I literally broke up the meeting because we were being very sincere. We did the chants of the whole bit. And then he brought up, Arjuna and Krishna as the charioteer, and they were in a battle because, I guess the people that was sort of with him at one time were just being fraudulent, and he needed to even the score somehow. But Arjuna was very concerned because even though they did him wrong, they were people that he admired and loved at one time, and he didn't want to kill him, right? And Shiva kind of shook them up. He says, look, you are a soldier. Your duty is to be a soldier. You're in the cast. And, and I just got so upset by that because he was beginning to be much more humanistic and begin to think about, yeah, but that's going to create a lot of suffering and pain. I mean, I'm sure that whoever was leading the group, that guy, he was an Indian guy, was dismayed by my complaint. And I said, you're in a subtle way trying to assert the goodness of the caste system. And I said, I won't have it. I won't have it. And I objected. And I kind of make a big fuss and I walked out. And then I was a little surprised that the the meetup was abandoned. That was a live meetup. So that was before, we have all these webcasts. And apparently a number of people, because you are, after all, an American in a Western society, must agree with me, and they all many of them left anyway, so there was not enough left to hold the committee. So is that the reason why Buddhism arise? Because it saw all the corruption? What saved India was the fact that it never became an empire. It was a lot of just real powerful kingdoms. But within those kingdoms, it obviously was showing there was corrupting, you know, the Vedics in a way that it become an advantage. And so Buddhism, and it's sort of surprising, Buddhism arose from India, but it didn't survive very well. I mean, I think there might be still small sects, but it's not very prominent. It had to move to Southeast Asia and to a certain degree in Ceylon. And so interesting. And I'm thinking, okay, the Buddha now had, and what's amazing about the Buddha is that till the end of his life, he told his disciples, please don't make me into a god. I mean, he pleaded with them, please don't make him the god. Of course, as soon as he died, they disobey him. They carved big statues to assert that he was God. You know, I mean, it's like they turned it into a religion. What he was definitely a kind of a humanist. You know, in fact, he did say an earlier thing that I always admire him of saying, if you should run into me in the road, you need to kill me. He didn't literally mean that. He mean that metaphorically. You have to go on your own, you know, because you are gonna supposedly surpass me, and that's what you should do. Think
Yeah.
for yourself, you know. I mean, in the beginning, maybe I could help you out. That's why you don't want to turn me into a god. That's why I wrote one of the poems that I wrote that I feel good about was I actually wrote about the Buddha Bemiyan, you know, the one that was blown up by the Taliban. And I said, I began with the fact that it was those heathens that hated him that blew him up, that liberated Buddha. He's just a pile of rubble, you know what I mean? And like, and then at the end, there was the his body was all blown up. There was no more body, but the head was still there, and there was a very silent smile.
Little smile on the Buddha's head.
The
Probably
silent
not to make
smile of
statues to
Buddha
his
that
feet.
he's finally in nirvana. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting, like because he well, he was a little bit pessimistic because he didn't want to return. You know, nirvana is nothingness and is like escaping the pain and the suffering of life. You know,
Yes.
he doesn't want the eternal return.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
does not want the eternal return. So,
Once is enough.
yeah, right. Well, I'm sure he went through it several times, and he's like, "Oh, this is
1,000
the
times is
last time."
enough.
That's right. I, I am going to nirvana, the
That's right.
eternal nothingness. That's a little pessimistic for me, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting that nirvana is actually not transcendence, but the end of immanence. Okay, I'll just leave that. Just be careful that you don't turn something into a democracy. A class system maybe is okay, still enough flexibility, but do not turn it into a caste system. And
Yes.
that's what we're beginning to do actually in our
Yes.
democracy. So there you have it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Well, it's good. We got new material out of paragraph 7 and 8, and we got through paragraph 9. Next time we're gonna pick up with, God help us, paragraph 10. We're moving along. It's Kenneth's on a roll in this chapter, laying the pieces out for how the medieval world gets started. And I guess,
Okay, 10-4.
right?
Out.
And I just want to stress, setting us up for next week, all the effort I'm going to show the contradictions within the central orthodoxy at the beginning of the medieval epoch is in no way meant to say that that's the sum total of the medieval epoch, because it changes so much over the next 1,000 years, and it spins off so many different sects and little monasteries and nunneries and visionaries. So it's a huge amount of stuff that makes the medieval world go. This is just what the goals were, the original promise, and kind of where it went wrong. Anyway, thanks everybody. I had a great time. I hope you had a great time, and we'll pick this up next week.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate